Chapter 794. When humans were extremely thirsty, they would instinctively seek water. When humans were extremely cold, they would automatically seek warmth. This was a biological instinct that had nothing to do with love or emotions. Sylvanas was actually in a situation where her life force was forcefully sucked away, her will damaged, and her soul temporarily weakened. Only those who experienced it firsthand would understand how terrifying Death Coil was when a fallen Breaking Dawn mage threw it at them. Against a class that relied on high agility to dodge attacks, a single hit from a Breaking Dawn mage would definitely freeze her blood, stop her heartbeat, and take her life. This was the result of a Nastrian deliberately holding back in order to force Sylvanas to surrender. The darkness faded from Sylvanas' eyes, the coldness on her body quickly decreasing, but the color did not recover. Even though there was no need for red, blue, or yellow, even in a world completely composed of lines and outlines, she could still recognize the person who saved her life and soul. Xueqi. For the past 10 years, every time she dreamt about her sisters at night, the hateful man would always accompany her. Even though she did not want to admit it, she had to admit that he was the most heroic man. The man who could not even find a replacement, much less surpass him. Once upon a time, she sincerely wished for her sisters to choose a true hero as her partner. On the other hand, she was indignant and longed to find a partner who surpassed Xueqi. It was just that she had never thought that she would be like a young girl in love, offering her kiss as if she was asking for a kiss. Moreover, it was the most precious first kiss. She could not describe the complicated and contradictory feelings in her heart. She was grateful to Xueqi for pulling her out of the shackles of death and despair, but she also blamed Xueqi for only coming now. She was also a little conflicted about her own failure. Countless thoughts intertwined, and the end result was that her mind was blank. She stuck out her tongue, as if she was thirsting for water. The result was a classic French kiss. Sylvanas was about to go crazy. She did not know why she would do this. How was she any different from the noble girl who shamelessly fawned on Xueqi in the Palace of Rotterdam, hoping to become the Grand Duchess? However, Xueqi's posture of carrying her was very skillful and incomparably smooth. Sylvanas knew very well that Xueqi was used to carrying his eldest sister and third sister. Although their physiques were slightly different, the three sisters' body proportions were extremely similar. It was as if the fourth had intruded into the love domain of his eldest sister and third sister, and then the bastard Xueqi had subconsciously treated her as his sister and accepted her. What kind of bad debt was this? Furthermore, this was in front of tens of thousands of elven subordinates who respected and admired her. Even though Sylvanas had already discovered the traces of illusion around Xueqi, and guessed that Xueqi had used some kind of illusion to cover up the subtle and chaotic situation, but the inexplicable sense of shame made every inch of her exposed skin turn bright red, as if it was burning. Finally, Sylvanas, who had recovered her strength, pushed Xueqi away and cursed fiercely in the language of the wind. Damn it! I was out of my mind just now. I forgot about this. I order you to forget about this immediately. Okay, if I can do it. Xueqi was a little helpless. He did not know what this was, but it seemed that he had another bad debt. In all honesty, he had never thought of hitting on Queen Sylvanas. Xueqi shrugged. Should we deal with the Sun King first? Sylvanas knew that Xueqi was forcibly changing the topic, but she had to suppress her anger and nodded. There must be a reason why Xueqi appeared at this time. And Xueqi was the only hope to save hundreds of thousands of her people. Xueqi's illusion could only fool ordinary elves. Sun King and Kai Zi were shocked when they saw their passionate kiss. Who would have thought that Lilith would suddenly jump out, and then Xueqi? Xueqi seemed to have an affair with the two daughters of the Windrunner family? No, for an ambitious person, perhaps this was something that could be used. But a Nastrian was more concerned about why the extremely noble Xueqi would appear here alone. After the leader of the alliance, King Tarinas, was killed, although the alliance did not exist in name, among the remaining members, there was no longer a situation where one party was the strongest. In this situation, as the supreme commander, Xueqi became the person with the highest status. It was not an exaggeration to say that if Xueqi died, the alliance would immediately collapse. Sun King narrowed his eyes, looking enraged. With a wave of his hand, a huge black wave of fire over 30 meters tall pressed towards Xueqi's head. Duke Marcus, you have no right to appear in my territory. A breaking dawn bullying a radiant moon was a classic example of the strong bullying the weak. Logically speaking, there was no way that Xueqi would be spared. The elven mages could almost foresee the scene of Duke carrying their great hero, Sylvanas, in a sorry state as he retreated. They did not expect this at all. "Oh, is that so?" Duque smiled lightly and snapped his fingers. A 40-meter-long battleship blade made of pure golden flames appeared out of thin air. It looked like it could even split a battleship in two with one slash. With just one slash, he had broken through Anastrian's waves of fire in the truest sense of the word. This was a double suppression in terms of quality and attributes. The Sun King, who had clearly lost his vision due to the loss of blood and had just become an undying not long ago, widened his eyes in shock and let out a strange, distorted cry. "This, no, can. It was not just the Sun King. Every elf who witnessed this miraculous scene cried out in surprise. Normally speaking, this was indeed impossible. Low-level mysteries would undoubtedly be crushed by higher-level powers. It was just like how an egg could not beat a stone, and a stone could not beat a diamond. Even elven children could understand such a simple logic. But why was that? The Elven King, who was dressed in luxurious robes, poked the ground with his staff in horror. He discovered that from this moment onwards, the magic vein that extended from the sun well was no longer responding. Alarm bells rang in his mind. If he could still sweat, Anastrian would definitely be drenched in cold sweat. Since he could not defeat the Calamity Army, he might as well turn the entirety of Xueqi into a nation of the undead for him to maintain his power and rule. Chapter 795. Shock, shock, shock. Everything that had happened in front of the royal court was full of twists and turns. From the fall of the Sun King to the prince's cowardice, to Sylvanas' resistance and defeat, and finally to Duke's sudden appearance. Contrary to the expectations of the world, he used the power of the radiant moon to defeat the attack of the fallen Sun King. The scene was so shocking that every elf felt dizzy, and they didn't even dare to breathe. Everyone wanted to say, "Impossible." After all, up until this moment, Duque still had the aura of a radiant moon. Perhaps he was truly at the peak of the radiant moon realm. But since ancient times, many amazingly talented powerhouses had fallen in the face of the merciless passage of time. It seemed like they were just a step away from breaking dawn, but it was actually an extremely high and dangerous threshold. Only Anastrian vaguely realized what Duque had done. You stole the veins of the earth." His voice trembled as he revealed the truth of the matter. What? Duque could actually use the power of the sun well? How was that possible? The method of using the sun well had always been a secret of the Sunstrider royal family. Even the counselors of the Silver Moon Council only knew a little about it. How could an outsider like Duque, who wasn't even a high elf, use the power of the sun well? After all, there was no possibility of the secret being leaked. The Windrunner sisters that Duque had picked up were only rangers, not high-ranked wizards. What Duque had taken back then was merely a manual for learning the magic circuit of Phoenix Flames. No one would have thought that a freak like Duque could actually use the system elf and his understanding of Phoenix Flames to reverse engineer the control code of the Sunwell's veins of the earth. Anastrian was going crazy. Duque puffed out his chest, his expression full of confidence. "Steal? Why do I remember that it was your father, Dasrima, who stole a bottle of eternal water confiscated from Illidan to create the sun well? Besides, if your father's soul is still watching Xueqi, he'll definitely be shocked by your depravity and your terrifying idea of trying to defile the well of the sun." Anastrian's lungs were about to explode. "The sun well belongs to Queldori. I'm just borrowing it to destroy a villain like you who has desecrated the sacred life." Duque's words obviously appeased the high elves who were a little uneasy. This also made the rangers who loved the forest and life to have a good impression of Duque. Sometimes, Duque wished he was a devil, so that everything he did would be simpler and more violent. Unfortunately, the Alliance's general direction of inclusiveness could not be destroyed. Just like before the fall of the Sun King, he had no right to intervene in the Elf Kingdom. The Alliance was just the Alliance, not the Federation. The Federation was a unified country with only one boss. The Alliance was just a large group of equal kingdoms and forces, a union formed to fight against evil and destruction. If Duque ignored the sovereignty of other countries and wantonly killed their kings, forcing a race or country to join the Alliance, it would mean that the Alliance had changed. It would definitely be opposed by the kings of the various countries, and it would be impossible for there to be a strong alliance in the future. Of course, if the king of a country jumped to the opposing side of the Alliance, it would be a different story. Duque turned his head and looked at the shocked Sylvanus with an embarrassed expression. I'm sorry, I have to first obtain control of the Sun Well before I can save you and your people. Then, Duque waved his hand, and the magic hand that had just suppressed Hadgeron and Lord Themar was immediately shattered, dissipating in the wind. The next second, there was a series of continuous cannon roars on the sea west of Silvermoon City. The sound of the cannons was so loud that it seemed to be blowing away all the clouds within thousands of miles, as if it was going to overturn the entire sky. There was only one fleet in this world that could launch such a dense and violent bombardment, the combined fleet of Kurtiras and Stormwind. The Sun King was horrified. Didn't your army head south? A smile appeared on Duque's face. That's just what you think. At this point, Duque's plan was completely revealed. Although this was not a typical case of the third party benefiting from the fight, Duque had clearly made the Scarlet Cross pretend to go south to support the Silver Pine Forest. In reality, they had circled around the sea, and then hid in the sea west of Cuel Salas. Because the focus of the elves' defense was concentrated on the land in the south, no one had actually discovered such a large army gathering on the sea. When the Sun King fell and changed sides, Duque no longer had any scruples. He decisively sent the largest fleet in history, with a total of 4 digits, to attack the Calamity army that had just landed. This move of Duque's could not be said to be not vicious. In this fleet, there was indeed no one who could match Arthas. The problem was that the magic power of Frostmourne was not endless. Now that Duque had partial control of the Sun Well, if Arthas dared to attack the Alliance's fleet with all his strength, Duque was confident that he could seize the opportunity to take full control of the Sun Well and make things difficult for the two fools. At this moment, on the northernmost isle of Quel'Donas in the Eastern Kingdom, Arthas' face was dark. The cannonballs rained down on the Calamity army, and there was nothing he could do. As soon as he sent the gargoyles over, they were immediately blocked by the Griffin Knights of Eagle Nest Mountain, and the two sides fought fiercely above the sea. The gargoyles had the advantage in numbers, but the Griffin Knights had the upper hand in terms of quality. No matter how he looked at it, he would not be able to stop this high-speed fleet for a while. Antonidas. The veteran Breaking Dawn wizard was Arthas' last trump card. However, just as the Great Lich flew into the sky on the Bone Griffin, he encountered a difficult opponent, Krasis. This Kirin Tor counselor did not appear in the form of a high elf. He had returned to his original dragon form. In all fairness, a strong red dragon that was less than 10,000 years old was not a match for the Great Lich. However, based on his understanding of magic, and relying on the natural thick skin and amazing magic resistance of the dragons, Krasis was able to fight Antonidas to a draw. Moreover, Krasis remembered Duque's instructions. Don't fight Antonidas head-on, and don't protect a ship. You just need to keep him busy for 10 minutes, 20 minutes at most, and I'll be able to rush over to deal with him. Krasis was like a large annoying red fly, flying around at high speed and high magic resistance. From time to time, he would ruthlessly attack Antonidas. Chapter 796. It wasn't that Antonidas didn't try to bypass Krasis and attack the Alliance's warships directly. Krasis didn't care at all. If you want to fight, just fight. If I find an opening, I'll give you a good beating. Taking advantage of the Great Lich's powerful spell, the red dragon bit down, almost biting off the Great Lich's rotten left thigh. The advantage was obvious, but the Great Lich couldn't advance. This was the dragon at the top of the Azeroth food chain. It was extremely difficult to deal with. This stalemate made Arthas a little crazy, and he had to send a message to the Sun King. Anastrian, what are you doing? Isn't it just a radiant moon, Duque? Get rid of him quickly and come over. Get rid of Duque? How? Hearing the death order from the soul, the Sun King was dumbfounded as he watched Duque's mana surge. He had been humiliated twice in one day. Half a day ago, he had lost to Antonidas because of his old age. He had been guarding an almost inexhaustible mana vein in the Sun Well, but he had been defeated because he couldn't transfer mana efficiently enough. Now, he was at a disadvantage because he had brought it upon himself. After transforming into a Great Lich, the bottleneck in converting mana had disappeared, and his efficiency had increased by many times. Unfortunately, if the power of darkness was negative, then the mana of the Sun Well was a classic example of positive energy. Who would have thought that he, the owner of the Sun Well for thousands of years and the master of the Sun Well, would be unable to control the Sun Well perfectly because of the change in his body's attributes? Duke, the schemer, had stolen the control and turned the tables? If Xueqi had come earlier, then with the advantage of the Sun Well, Anastrian might have had the confidence to fight Arthas and Antonidas head-on. If Xueqi had come later, Arthas would have used Frostmourne to successfully corrupt the Sun Well and convert its power into evil mana that Anastrian could use at will. Then, he would have beaten Xueqi to a pulp. However, Xueqi had attacked at this critical juncture, when he was at his weakest, and there was nothing he could do. What was even worse was that he couldn't resist Arthas' orders at all. That was a punishment from a higher level of the soul, and it wasn't something a servant like him could endure. He almost fell to his knees on the spot. He struggled as if to make his posture less unsightly, but this action increased his agony. Anastrian let out a scream from the depths of his soul, and through his withered vocal cords, he let out a furious roar. The roar did not only emit his agony, but also the stench of dark energy. The black aura was visible to the naked eye, like water ripples, spreading out from his mouth in waves. The Sun King raised his staff with one hand and made a summoning gesture with the other, pulling the entire palace out of the embrace of death and tranquility. A neutral arcane light suddenly burst out of the palace. The few fallen counselors behind him also understood what was going on. They activated Flash and left the palace gate. They were located in the towers at the corners of the palace. Of course, the Sun King's trump card was not just the Sun Well's dermic power earth vein. On the surface, the entire sun-chasing royal court was a palace, but in fact, it was only his mage tower. He couldn't resist Arthas' orders, so he could only take a gamble. He was betting that Xueqi didn't have complete control over the dermic power vein that extended from the Sun Well. As long as Xueqi's power was weak or flawed, he was 100% sure that he could blast Xueqi, the detestable troublemaker, into smithereens. Xueqi gently waved his hand, and a few ranger generals led by Savannahs, including Lilith, had a few more magic shields on them, and they slowly floated backward. This was Xueqi protecting them. Pursing his lips, Savannah still had some embarrassment on his face, and finally said, "Be careful." Thousands of words were all in the word, careful. Xueqi turned back and smiled. "I will." It was just the simplest response and a gentle smile, but Savannah's felt as if his heart was touched by something. Bastard. That's the Sun King. He'd been the king of the entire continent for thousands of years, and his strength was only second to the World Guardian. Are you that confident? Are you that confident that you can control the violent dermic power vein of the Sun Well? Bastard, aren't you afraid of biting your tongue with such big words? In Savannah's heart, the resentment and anger from a moment ago completely turned into worry at this moment. Even she herself didn't realize that her gaze actually couldn't leave Duke's back anymore. Watching the blue and gold-edged lion head image flutter in the wind behind Xueqi, Savannah's eyes unknowingly became misty. Xueqi had no time to care about others. Facing a true Breaking Dawn mage was definitely the greatest challenge Xueqi had faced since he'd transmigrated. Even though he'd stolen the dermic power vein of the Sun Well, and even though he had the help of the system, he didn't dare to let his guard down. Every veteran powerhouse had countless trump cards, and if they weren't careful, they would all be defeated. Resurrection wasn't omnipotent, especially when Xueqi was facing a Breaking Dawn powerhouse who'd turned from a mage to an evil warlock. Warlocks at the master level and above were all experts at playing with souls. At the thought of this, Xueqi couldn't help but feel his scalp go numb. Now, Xueqi had no choice but to experience how terrifying Pharaoh, who'd mastered both mage and warlock magic, was. Xueqi stretched out his hands in front of his chest, palms facing downwards. He wasn't just controlling it. He was also using his spirit to feel the pulse of magic coming from the Sun Well. The sun shone on all things, bringing warmth and light to all living beings in the Azeroth lands. The calmness and warmth that the Sun Well had always given outsiders was the effect of being solidified and stabilized by complex and powerful magic arrays. The real Sun Well had never been a docile lord. Rather than a well, it was more like a huge and unstable nuclear reactor. It surged like the sun. Irregular energy shocks were occurring at every moment. Some were like raging waves crashing against the shore, giving people an impact and shock that was still within one's imagination. There were also a few shock waves that were earth-shattering and earth-shattering. Without extraordinary power, just touching this power would cause a backlash, let alone controlling it. Not to mention controlling it, just touching it would cause one to be devoured until not even dregs were left. However, in Xueqi's hands, the power of the sun well was suddenly divided into 12 types according to its attributes. Just as the sun chaser court shone brightly, Xueqi was slowly lifted into the air by the golden, seemingly substantial magic power. Under Xueqi's feet, there were 12 gigantic magic stairs that extended to the front of the court like stairs. Xueqi, who was emitting golden light and looked like a god descending to the world, spoke slowly. Anastrian, don't say that I didn't give you a chance. Show me what you've got. Chapter 797. Prince Kale, who had unknowingly stood up and retreated to the side awkwardly, had shock written all over his face. The Sun King Anastrian's face was pale, and the skin on his face that was constantly stirring dark magic undulated like waves. Impossible! Impossible! This can't be true. Anastrian was going crazy. He didn't want to believe that Xueqi, an outsider and despicable thief, could actually use the power of the sun well better than him, the real owner. Even he only dared to use a giant magic array to purify the magic of the sun well, and only used the mildest part of it. How could Xueqi do this? With a thought, the 12 magic towers at the front of the Sunchaser dynasty shone with a dazzling arcane light at the same time. The next moment, accompanied by a strange sizzling sound that sounded like an overload of electricity, the 12 magic lights combined into one, crossed the distance of nearly 100 meters, and blasted in front of Xueqi. Xueqi exhaled, and 2 words popped out of his good-looking lips. Libra. It was a concept that did not belong to the world of Azeroth. Libra. In Xueqi's original world, the legendary Greek goddess of war and wisdom Athena had set up 12 harems for her 12 gigolos. Ahem, wrong. It should be said that this was purely a trick that Xueqi, who had been deeply poisoned by a certain anime, had set up according to the legendary zodiac signs. The use of all elemental magic at or below Breaking Dawn was nothing more than 3 steps. The first was to summon the maximum amount of magic that one could control. The second was to shape and control the magic, and the third was to release the magic in a safe and correct way. Shaping magic did not only have to consider the mage's control, but also the mage's own imagination. Instead of using those magic models that he was not familiar with, but were theoretically the most optimized, it was better to use some more suitable magic forms that Xueqi was most familiar with. Therefore, what the High Elves saw from afar was a glittering Einherjar with a blurry face, but wearing a strange armor, carrying a huge golden round shield, blocking in front of Xueqi. Is it a Einherjar? Or was it some kind of intelligent elemental creature? No one could figure it out, but it was obvious that the attack from the Sun King and the entire Royal Court's Mage Tower was easily blocked. The elemental shockwaves scattered in all directions easily crushed the solid white jade stairs into pieces. This kind of expensive and special stone material, which might not even have a crack after being smashed by a big iron hammer dozens of times, was easily crushed into powder under such a violent elemental impact. No. What is this? Summoning? Or is it something else? Anastrian was at a loss for words. No, in fact he was thinking too much. This was purely a person's way of showing off. Fallen, Xueqi told the Sun King. True power can never be obtained through twisted sacrifice. And when you do that, you will only go further and further down the path of self-destruction. I don't need you pointing at me. Sun King let out an even louder roar. He put his palms together, and the magnificent staff floating 1 meter above his head began to spin clockwise at a high speed. The mage towers erected throughout the palace also began to surge with intense elemental undulations. Clearly, this was another big move. Xueqi did not have the luxury to let the opponent use his big move. Although he had mastered the magical ley line that extended from the Well of the Sun, the so-called infinite magical power was just an illusion. After all, he only controlled the branch and not the Sun Well itself. Moreover, Arthas was rushing to the Sun Well in an attempt to use it to revive Kel, Thuzad. Alright, if others used the Sun Well, they would at most draw some magical power or something. Arthas was much more disgusting than the famous dog, Arathika. Calling him an ex-stirrer was already a compliment. The Sun Well that had been used by the idiot in history was directly contaminated by strong evil power, causing the entire territory of Kuel Salis to be filled with rot and plague. How was this an ex-stirrer? This was clearly using a bomb to blow up a septic tank. If he did not want to see Aurelia and Sasha's heartbroken expressions when they returned, Xueqi's only choice was to end the battle quickly. Ha! Xueqi shouted softly, and a huge circle of golden ripples spread out in the air. The 12 golden stairs beneath Xueqi's feet instantly transformed into 12 illusory golden giants that were 5 people tall. The 12 golden kidney warriors wielded different weapons, each possessing elemental energy of different attributes. They quickly pounced towards the wizard towers in every corner of the palace. The Sun King was shocked. The reason why wizard towers were so difficult to deal with was because each wizard tower usually only had one main attribute. Once there were many wizard towers, they could use magic of different attributes to support each other. No matter who the enemy was, they would always be able to find a way to deal with them. Now that Xueqi moved his finger, the 12 golden giants that charged over scared the Sun King's radiant moon liches to the point of pissing their pants. How were these illusory golden giants? They were clearly 12 breaking dawn wizard towers that could run, fly, and self-destruct. Of course, Xueqi could not completely control the earth-shattering power of the sun well. If Xueqi could only control a basin of water the size of a basin, then the sun well was at least a standard 50 by 25 meter swimming pool. However, even if Xueqi was holding a basin, as long as it was not a pool of water that was poured onto Xueqi's head, Xueqi had the ability to use the basin to guide the astonishing power of the sun well. The simplest way was naturally to divert the energy. Suddenly, a wave of golden light shone brightly. The elemental power that had leapt out from the wizard towers was suppressed by the even larger power of the sun well. 12 shocking explosions rang out one after another. The golden dome, the jade white tower, and the mysterious magic power that lingered around them were all destroyed in an instant. The 12 golden kidney warriors that had crashed into them used their even greater destructive power to easily destroy the towers that had stood in Silvery Moon City for more than 5,000 years. Since the wizard towers had been destroyed, the liches inside naturally did not have it easy. Their gloomy souls carried an indescribable fear as they hovered over the rubble. Looking at their shattered corpses that could never be restored, they widened their eyes in disbelief and looked towards Xueqi. No! The cries from the souls were hollow and eerie. It was almost impossible to tell how noble and elegant the owner of these voices had been when he was alive. Unfortunately, they could only cry out to vent their anger and fear. At this moment, Xueqi was practically possessed by the sun god. He was not someone weak souls like them could approach. If they came within 100 meters of Xueqi, they would be burned to ashes by this terrifying heat. Chapter 798. Bastard. Duke Marcus. If you had such power, why didn't you? The Sun King was interrupted by Xueqi before he could finish roaring. Xueqi did not hide the disgust on his face. Do you want to ask why I didn't inform you when I discovered the Calamity Army's movements? Or do you want to ask why I didn't come to Xueqi like a plaything to help you block the Calamity Army? Wake up, the glorious era of the High Elves is long over. The Sun King was speechless. The so-called politicians, even if their hearts were filled with filth, would always be like a spring breeze on their faces that were full of acting skills. Now that Duke did not care about politics at all. He did not care about the rules in the field of politics. Instead, he felt that he was at a loss for what to do. Most of the High Elves in the distance could not hear their conversation. Of course, this did not include the strongest ranger generals. The clever Lord Themar had obviously thought about why the human allied forces had appeared at such a precise time. However, how could they blame Xueqi? How could they vent their anger on the alliance? From the secret notification and warning to the official visit of Duke Bolvar, the alliance had not only extended an olive branch, but also sent an olive tree over. But what did the Sun King and the Silver Moon Council do? Other than playing some dirty little schemes to trick Servana's back, it could be said that he had done nothing at all. The High Elves, especially the Rangers, were grieved by the filth and corruption of those in power. This was not just a year or two. It had been like this since the Troll War 2,800 years ago. It was just that the peaceful years had covered up this filth. Now, when the chaotic times came, the seemingly powerful Xueqi showed its corruption and weakness time and time again. The blindly superstitious large area defense spell formation was broken without any use. The first time, it was modified by Ghoul Dan into the Storm Altar and produced twin-headed ogres to fight the High Elves. The second time was even worse. Even the magic of the Well of the Sun in the veins had been used, and the violent energy flow had destroyed more than half of Silver Moon City. If it weren't for Xueqi and the Alliance's fleet, not only would Xueqi have been completely destroyed, but even less than 10% of the millions of elves would have survived. Lord Themar and Hadgeron looked at each other. They saw the same thing in each other's eyes. Anger towards the Sunstrider royal family and the Silver Moon Council, as well as an unparalleled desire for reform. It was impossible for Xueqi to notice their little thoughts. Nor did he have the time to care about such a small matter. He focused all his attention on the Sun King because the Great Lich was ready to fight with all his might. The soul punishment from Arthas was getting sharper and sharper. The once mighty Sun King bent his back in pain and let out a heart-wrenching scream. He was painfully and indignantly aware of what it meant to be unable to please either side. Facing Arthas, he had no power to resist. From the moment he volunteered to become a Great Lich, he was destined to be a tool of the fallen prince. Just like those rotten zombies and pale, rotten ghouls, they were just tools. The crown that still rested on his head was only a final fig leaf. Facing Xueqi, he also felt a sense of helplessness. Being able to control 2 of the 12 different powers of the Well of the Sun at the same time was beyond imagination. Yet, Xueqi could still maintain his leisurely manner. Perhaps outside, he could casually beat up Xueqi 10,000 times. But at this moment and place, Xueqi was almost invincible. Damn it, how can a short-lived human like you understand the benefits of eternity? You won't understand. You short-lived ghost. The Sun King was already a little out of control. Sensitively aware of the flaw that the Sun King had inadvertently revealed, Xueqi decided to take the opportunity to expand this flaw. With a faint smile on his face, he replied slowly, "Idiot! Even the eternal life blessing that the World Tree brought to the Night Elves was bestowed by the Red Dragon Queen, Alexstrasza. As the great hero who saved Alexstrasza, do you think I don't have eternal life?" Xueqi spoke in the whisper of wind. Other than the designated target, the 2 windrunners could also hear the whisper of wind. Lilith didn't feel anything. But after Sylvanas heard it, she blushed at the thought of that possibility. Of course, a Nastrian wouldn't notice the reaction of a mere female ranger. He was completely shocked by Xueqi's reply. It was as if a bolt of lightning had descended from the 9 heavens and suddenly struck his forehead. Eladisinolii. This was the most vicious elven curse that good children didn't need to understand. It contained the deepest resentment of the Sun King, which was 10 million times deeper than having sex with a dog. Because of the pursuit of eternity, he made a difficult decision: to give up life. He gave up the beauty, nobility, and holiness that the High Elves were most proud of, and willingly became a dirty and ugly Great Lich. What was it for? In the end, wasn't it for eternal power and power? Now he didn't hesitate to fall, and he even tricked his assistant, his own son, and even his own guards and subjects. You, Xueqi, a mere human, actually came out and said that I don't need to become a lich to be a scourge for 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. Although Xueqi wasn't too handsome, it was still infuriating to compare. An eternally youthful young man, who looked like he was 18 years old, was 100 million times better than a lich with a rotten face. Ah! What? How could a Nastrian stand it? However, just when a Nastrian was so angry that his soul was about to melt, the shameless Xueqi naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. He decisively made his move. Countless golden, basin-sized, mysterious magic runes appeared on the ground in every corner of the palace. These runes seemed to be just printed at first, but in just 3 seconds, they turned into dazzling runes. Not only did these runes have a huge mysterious power that could be sensed without experience, but they were also connected with each other by shining threads of light, forming a huge magic array that ran through the entire sun-chasing royal court. Oh! You! The long dry beard that remained on the Sun King's chin was blown away by the blazing magic wind. Before he could scold, Xueqi's magic array had already been activated. It was a huge golden pillar of light with a diameter of several kilometers, reaching straight into the sky. The shining pillar that connected this world and released a radiance comparable to the sun could be clearly seen from 100 kilometers away. Xueqi blew up the palace. Chapter 799. This big move was not the traditional mushroom cloud bomb. The entire palace was like a small model directly burned by a giant welding torch with flames. In an instant, it burned to ashes. Every single elf who witnessed this scene was stunned. In the end, they all understood. Their king had fallen, and the Sunchasur King's court, which was both the palace and the king's exclusive mage tower, was a hurdle that they could not avoid in resisting the invasion of evil. They had no reason to blame Xueqi. It was just that when Xueqi used the power of the Sun Well to destroy the palace that had stood in the northwest of Silvery Moon City for thousands of years and had a history as long as Silvery Moon City, they still felt a sense of emptiness and loss in their hearts. This was a collapse of faith. This was the severance of a legacy. Xueqi's attack, whether intentional or unintentional, directly broke their last hope for the Sunchasur royal family. Yes, the shameless Xueqi did it on purpose. He did not know if Kale, that's in this life, would fall as he did in the original history. Since Kai, that's chose to kneel to his father, who had become a skeleton, and not be a good loyal minister of the alliance, he jumped to the side of the rebels and licked the dead Nazul, becoming the subordinate of the Burning Legion's subordinate. Kai, that's had to take full responsibility for his actions. Xueqi did not care who would be the leader of the High Elves, but it definitely could not be the Sunchasur King's family or the Silvery Moon Council. In the face of right and wrong, there was no room for even the slightest bit of sand. Xueqi's attack was absolutely fierce. He had intended to deal with Anastrian and the entire Sunchasur King's court in one go. Unfortunately, a veteran Breaking Dawn powerhouse was not so easy to kill. Antonidas would not have knelt so easily if he had not been attacked by a large number of dreadlords. If Anastrian had enough will to resist, with the defense of the Sunwell and the Sunchasur King's court, he could have held on for a long time even if he could not win. Of course, if the Sun King did not join the alliance, Xueqi would rather let the hundreds of thousands of troops sit in the cabin until their butts were sore than let the army come to the rescue. Under such a devastating attack, the Sun King still had the ability to activate a teleportation formation hidden in the palace. The destructive mana of the Well of the Sun had already seriously disrupted the stability of the surrounding space, and even Xueqi, who had the system elf, did not have the confidence to escape. However, the Sun King had successfully turned into a stream of light and escaped. Xueqi squinted his eyes, feeling no pity in his heart. He had always been a person who grasped the big and let go of the small. Once the big strategy was achieved, he would not care about the small details. Moreover, the Doomsday Army was not a charity. Arthes wanted the Sun King to block the way, but Anastrian actually dared to run away by himself? In the situation where Nazul still had absolute control over the Scourge, please allow Xueqi to mourn for the Sun King for half a second. At this time, Nazul was no different from a young wife who had been brutally abused. Kil Jaden could do whatever he wanted with Nazul. He could flatten it or carve Nazul's skull into a urinal. Nazul could only accept it. Nazul was angry at the top, so he could only vent his anger on his underlings. As the underlings of the Burning Legion, when they could complete the boss's task, they could have as many succubi as they wanted, and they could pose in any position they wanted. Not doing their job well? That would be too much. The Scourge was even worse. They did not even have the benefits of succubi, and they were often punished by the soul. This time, it would be strange if Anastrian's soul was not used as fuel, lit on fire, and roasted for chicken wings. So this time, when Xueqi saw a certain newly promoted Great Lich running away, he only wanted to give this poor thing 4 words. He. The monstrous golden light finally dissipated, and what appeared in front of the tens of thousands of elves was a huge circular ruin that was so clean that it could be used as a skating rink. Some elves cried on the spot. But more elves began to gather and approach Xueqi. They looked at the great traitor of the High Elves, Kale, that Sunstrider, with eyes that could cut people into 1,000 pieces, while waiting for the final orders of their leaders. Many elves had already secretly tightened their grip on the weapons in their hands. If Servanas, Lord Themar, and the other leaders gave the order to kill this guy, they would probably pounce on him without hesitation. Kale that's face was ashen, and his handsome face had lost all its vigor. His emerald green eyes were unfocused, and even though he had already stood up, he looked more like a walking corpse than a zombie at this moment. A few of the prince's loyal followers, such as the great astromancer Solarian, pursed their lips and gripped their staffs tightly as they stood in front of Kale. That's blocking the increasingly turbulent elven army. Unfortunately, the obstruction of a mere radiant moon mage was meaningless. Just one spark would ignite the anger in everyone's hearts, and the once noble elven prince would be completely destroyed by his own people. Hadgeron was still a little confused. He instinctively hated Kale, that's, who had sold everyone's lives and succumbed to his father's evil might. But he could not personally kill Prince Kale, that's, who had not done anything evil. What do we do? Servanas raised his head and looked at Xueqi. To a certain extent, this was no longer the internal affairs of a mere elven kingdom. Now everyone knew that without the support of the alliance, the elves would not be far away from extinction. Xueqi took a deep breath. Right now, the alliance's greatest enemy is the Burning Legion and the Scourge Legion, who are trying to destroy the world of Azeroth. The alliance will definitely strike and absolutely destroy the evildoers and the fallen. When Xueqi said this, the faces of Kale, that's and his followers turned pale. Solarian even looked at Xueqi with a pleading look. Xueqi understood this look. If he could save Prince Kale that's life, this great astromancer was willing to pay any price. At this moment, Servanas and Lord Themar pulled out their arrows at almost the same time. Hadgeron was half a beat slower, and he was also ready to shoot. Kale that's raised his head and revealed a sad smile. In his once clear and charming eyes, there was no resentment or anger, only a calm acceptance of fate. In the face of people and kinship, in the face of powerful evil and weak justice, he selfishly chose the fallen kinship and the powerful evil. Unfortunately, the seemingly powerful evil was directly defeated by a more powerful strategy and strength. He chose this path himself. Now it was time for Kale that's to pay the price. Yes. Even if Xueqi, who had a good relationship with him, wanted to sentence him to death, he had no regrets. Originally, Kale that's and his followers were in despair. Who would have thought that the situation would take a turn? The second half of Xueqi's sentence was, however, Prince Kale that's actions just now did not directly threaten the alliance. I don't think Kale that Sunstrider is a despicable fallen. So, in the name of the Supreme Commander of the Alliance, I solemnly declare that the relationship between your kingdom and Kale, that Sunstrider is your kingdom's internal affairs, and the Alliance has no right to interfere. Chapter 800. The three Ranger generals looked at each other and quickly walked together to start an emergency discussion. Not only them, but they also quickly summoned the remaining dozen or so Ranger captains, mage captains, and garrison captains. After a full 5 minutes of discussion, they reached an agreement. As the temporarily elected leader and representative, Sylvanas stood on a stone platform that only had half of it left. When her voice and image were transmitted by magic to every intact magic mirror in Xueqi, she spoke loudly. After the discussion of the National Salvation Committee, which was temporarily formed by me, Sylvanas Windrunner, Rothelma Theron, Hadgeron Mingy, and 18 other high-ranking individuals, I, in the name of the president of the Xueqi Salvation Society, declare that Kale, that Sunstrider, who once joined the Scourge Army, is a traitor. In view of the fact that Kale, that Sunstrider has not seriously harmed the interests of the High Elves, and based on Kale, that's contribution to the kingdom for more than 1,000 years, we have now decided to strip him of his prince status and sentence him to exile. From now on, Kale, that Sunstrider and his followers must leave the territory of Xueqi. At this moment the camera turned, and Sylvanas asked Kale, that's, Your Highness Kale, that's, do you have any objections to the people's punishment of you? Punishment of exile. This was already a great mercy. Since ancient times, no matter which world or which kingdom, treason was a heinous crime that could easily lead to the death of an entire family. As long as they were ruthless, it would not be a big deal to kill Kale, that's directly. Firstly, Kale that's was not sentenced to death, and secondly, he was very popular. The democratic tradition of the High Elves was in effect at this time. In addition, even the biggest master the Alliance had let Kale that's go. The High Elves, who were about to follow the Alliance, could not be the clown. In the end, Kale that's punishment was more like picking it up high and gently putting it down. Understanding this, even though Kale that's was sad, he had no choice but to accept this fact. The former prince had lost the chance to be crowned king forever because of that kneel. The elves quickly took care of their internal affairs. Without needing Xueqi to urge them, the anxious elves had already spontaneously organized themselves. Sylvanas raised her arms and shouted, The evil undead are attacking our glory, the sun well. In order to prevent evil from staining our holiness, we must form a stronger assault team to defend the Isle of Quel'Donas. Lord Themar ordered in an orderly manner. Divide the army according to the area. Arcane puppets will be at the front, infantry in the middle to protect the division, and rangers on the flanks. Reorganize the army immediately. Captains, report your combat power immediately. Hadgeron, who was in charge of scouting, said, Bring all the ships that can sail here. I need 5 destroyers to scout the eastern side of the island. Immediately send 2 boats to the Alliance to verify the Alliance's flag. We need to coordinate with the Alliance fleet. On the other side, Xueqi waited for the elemental tremors to subside before opening the portal. The Alliance's rescue team, led by the Bishop of Holy Light Benedictus, quickly rushed to the ruins of Silvermoon City to help the ordinary High Elves save their compatriots. High-grade paladin Riadaline led a team of silver hand paladins to Duque's side. She was about to say something when she saw Kale, that's slowly walking over. Duque stopped Riadaline from trying to block in front of him and slowly walked towards Kale. It was difficult to describe the pain in Kale, that's heart. For him, today was destined to be a nightmarish day. His hometown had been invaded, and the capital had fallen. His only relative and king, Anastrian, had fallen. For the sake of his family, and to prevent the tens of thousands of elites from being cruelly slaughtered, the prince had chosen to submit. In the end, the situation had reversed. His father, who had given up almost everything for him, had heartlessly abandoned him, leaving him to fend for himself in front of the angry soldiers. It was a miracle that the pain and despair had not driven him crazy on the spot. "I'm sorry, Duque. I seem to have messed up everything. Although I'm sad about this result, as long as the people can live a safe life, I won't have any complaints. Duque, can you promise me? This is a very easy thing for you." Duque nodded slowly. "Tell me, I'll do it." The higher one's status, the harder it was to talk. Many times, the value of a sentence from Duque could not be described as 1,000 words of gold. Now, Duque had agreed without even asking what the content was. Even though Kale, had never thought that he and Duque were best friends, he still felt that it was worth it to make a friend with Duque. A warm feeling arose in his heart. "You really do understand me. But I still hope that you will say it yourself. You will do your best to help take care of the High Elves." Duque smiled gently. "Of course I will take care of the High Elves." "Nonsense, if I don't take care of them, won't Aurelia and Sasha skin me alive? Then I have no regrets." Unexpectedly, at this moment, Kale, could show such a sincere smile from the bottom of his heart. Duque was stunned for a moment. Then, Duque remembered the tragic ending of Kale, in the original history. In the original history, the Sun King and all the members of the Silver Moon Council had died in this battle. In the history, Arthas was very principled and did not resurrect the Sun King and the others. The only one who was turned into an undead by Arthas was Servanas, who resisted the most fiercely. He turned Ciri into a banshee of death. When Kale, who was still in the Dalajan, rushed back, he encountered a complete mess. The kingdom had been destroyed, and less than 10% of the people were left. Most of the magic people who relied on the magic of the sun well for a long time actually had magic addiction, which was commonly known as magic addiction. In order to take revenge, Kaisi brought the healthiest elves back to the Alliance. Unfortunately, they were assigned to the overly suspicious Galathers, the commander of the Alliance who was fighting against the Scourge army in Lordaeron. In the history of the elves, just like in this life, they left the Alliance after the Second Battle of the Dark Portal. After betraying the Alliance and being crippled, they ran back to lick the Alliance. Naturally, they were looked down upon everywhere. In the end, they were forced to leave the Alliance by Queen Naga Vasht's plot and a little deception. In order to solve their magic addiction, they had to rely on Illidan, one of the most unreliable bosses in Azeroth, and use the power of the demon to suppress their magic addiction. Step by step, they were finally tricked by Kil'jaeden, and attempted to summon Kil'jaeden on the rebuilt Sun Well. This forced the Blood Elves to the opposite side of all the races in Azeroth. In the end, Prince Kale, was betrayed and died tragically on the Isle of Quell Donnas. Thinking of this, Duque could not help but sigh. Chapter 801. In history, the alliance of the Blood Elves and humans had ended up in such a state. Kale, was not the main culprit. The poor prince was born in this era and unfortunately became a victim of history. The choices he made were all choices that ordinary people would make. Therefore, Duque expressed the deepest understanding and sympathy for Kale, who had reached the end of the road. It was just that in the face of ruthless fate, the Blood Elf prince seemed particularly powerless. Coupled with his lack of courage and his legendary level E luck. Even if he wanted to kill the thief, he was powerless. As for Marshal Garithus, who had tricked Kale, into running away, he naturally had to bear the main responsibility for Kale, betrayal. This guy was narrow-minded, blindly subjective, and no matter what, he was not a competent leader. However, in the reality before Duque traveled to, leaders like this who were always suspicious of their subordinates could be seen everywhere. That was why there was such a golden saying, "Horses of 1,000 li are common, but Bolu is rare." In the hands of Garithus, a talent like Kale, would either become a useless horse and die of depression, or he would become a wild horse and be forced to jump ship. Before traveling to another world, players often compared the two princes, Arthas and Kael, that's. Xueqi was personally very unhappy. In Xueqi's eyes, Kai was much more adorable than the fool. Although Arthas' original intentions were good, he was too extreme and never listened to anyone's advice. He stubbornly regarded himself as the center of the world, and forcefully hoped that the entire process of the world would develop according to his personal wishes. His fall was due to the conspiracy of the Dreadlord and Kel, Thuzad. From another perspective, Arthas' extreme and self-centered personality was also due to the pampering and spoiling of Tyrrhenas, who claimed to be the best in the world. So even though he fell later, what Arthas did was a bloody tragedy like killing his father and teacher. Kael, that was different. From the beginning to the end, everything this respectable elf prince did was for his people. He hoped that the people would live a good life, that he could take revenge and destroy the Scourge army, that he could solve the people's demon addiction, and that the first point of departure in everything he does is the people. If Kael, who was so kind and had yet to join the Burning Legion, died tragically, Xueqi's own conscience would never forgive him. Besides, when Xueqi was sorting out the information of the Rotterdam East Army a few days ago, Xueqi accidentally saw Garithos' name. From the dossier that Mograine had given him, Xueqi saw that Galadhers was as unreliable as he had been in history. Xueqi directly took out the Queen's seal that Kalia had given him and pushed Garithos to the bottom. He found an excuse to promote him from brigadier general to captain, and threw him to the front lines as cannon fodder. In less than a week, Xueqi received a report that this guy had died in battle. Even his corpse had been recovered. Alright, idiots should die early and reincarnate. There was nothing wrong with this sentence. Xueqi raised his head. Kael, you did wrong this time. We are all high-ranking people, and we all know that there is no room for kinship in the face of great right and wrong. Kael, expression darkened. Xueqi, you're right to lecture me. Duke sighed in his heart. If Kai had knelt down a little later and waited for him to finish analyzing the Well of the Sun's mana veins with the system elf, Kai's situation wouldn't be as bad as it was now. Do you have any plans? Kael looked around. Beside him were hardcore supporters such as the great astromancer Solarian and the astromancer Caponia. His face was full of bitterness. We still love our motherland, but unfortunately, more than 3,000 people will be exiled because of my mistake. I've let them down. But to atone, I think we will go to various places in Rotterdam and continue to fight against the Scourge army in our own way. 3,000 people. Originally, Xueqi wanted to take Kael, people as his private army. But 3,000 people were a little too many. Also, Xueqi had to consider the feelings of the elves who were more loyal to Xuel Salis, especially Servanas. Servanas, in particular, was a hurdle that Duke could not avoid. Xueqi took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Do you know what will happen to you? You and those followers who trusted you and entrusted their lives to you will die meaninglessly in the land that the Scourge army has corrupted." Beside the prince, the great astromancer Solarian could not help but roar in grief and indignation. "What else can we do?" Beside Xueqi, the paladin Riadaline shouted, "Watch your tone, traitor!" Solarian was about to refute when Kael, stopped her. "This is my fault. Please don't vent your anger on Xueqi." The prince's concession made Solarian so sad that she almost cried. Xueqi gazed at this beautiful elf. He looked at this boss who would have been guarding the Storm Fortress in the original history of Draenor, and would have been killed by the Alliance army. Xueqi suddenly felt a different kind of emotion. "I know that your current status is a little awkward. Actually, if you are still willing to fight for Azeroth, I hope that you will help the Alliance guard the Dark Portal. This way, we can release the original Dalajan mages and put them into the war against the Scourge army." As soon as this sentence was said, there was a hissing sound in the surroundings. This was not Xueqi treating them badly. On the contrary, he was treating Kael, and the others too well. After so many years of operation, the Watcher Fortress in the Cursed Land was no longer the bitter and cold place it used to be. The guards of the Watcher Fortress were recognized as the most elite troops in the entire Alliance because they often had to fight with the demons and orcs that came out of the spatial rift. In the past 10 years, there was a saying, if you stay in the Watcher Fortress for 3 years, you will be promoted by 3 ranks when you return. Kael, was humiliated because he had succumbed to his fallen father. Now that Xueqi wanted Kael, to go to the Watcher Fortress, it was to distance Kael, from the rejection of the elves in Xuel Salis. Secondly, they did not have to go to Lordaeron, which had the worst relationship with the elves, to be looked down upon. Thirdly, it was to let them be gilded. Regardless of whether there was a large-scale invasion or not, the Dark Portal was the front line against the demons and orcs. If they could stay at the front line for a few years and return home, everyone would treat them as a warrior of the Alliance. This was the best redemption for Kale, Bats and his followers. Xueqi. We don't know how to thank you. Of course, we are willing to go to the Watcher Fortress. Xueqi patted Kai's shoulder. All right then. Get ready. I'll arrange for a ship to send you there. Chapter 802. In fact, after Kai Z renamed the High Elves as Blood Elves, the Blood Elves had another huge problem. Mana addiction. As a transmigrator, Xueqi knew how to deal with mana addiction. Of course, he wouldn't expose the Well of the Sun before it happened. It would be bad enough if the Well of the Alliance accidentally exploded. You could even predict mana addiction. How dare you say you didn't set us High Elves up? Sometimes, it wasn't a good thing to know too much about the situation. It was easy to hide it from outsiders, but not from the Windrunner sisters, who had amazing intuition. Mana addiction was a harmless problem, so Xueqi simply let it happen. Of course, the premise was that the Well of the Sun had to be contaminated like in history, and then it had to be exploded. As the ultimate treasure of the High Elves, the defense of the Well of the Sun was naturally the most important. The king could be replaced if he died, but if the Well of the Sun exploded, the High Elves' lifeline would be gone. The Well of the Sun was in danger, and the elves all looked like their butts were on fire. Xueqi. No rush. Speaking of the Well of the Sun, from Xueqi's point of view, it was better to destroy it. Publicly, as long as the Well of the Sun existed, the High Elves might not be able to use it to create a Breaking Dawn Pharaoh, but they could have as many ordinary mages as they wanted. After 2 disasters, the elves had lost a lot of strength, but given enough time, a new version of the Silver Moon Parliament would be in power sooner or later. Think about it, the High Elves looked down on their fellow Night Elves. Would they really look up to humans, dwarves and gnomes? Once their wings hardened again, the High Elves would definitely start clamoring to separate from the Alliance again. It couldn't be helped. Most of the High Elves had an incurable disease of arrogance flowing in their bones. As long as the Well of the Sun was not damaged, the elves would never be able to completely integrate into the Alliance. Also, privately, the current situation was that the mages had completely declined, and the rangers had risen. The 2 leaders of the rangers, Lord Themar and Hageron, were the Windrunner sisters' minions. Sylvanas had already become famous in this battle. Xueqi didn't know how far she could go in the future, but he would be happy no matter which one of the Windrunner sisters came to power. Wasn't it good to have one of their own on the stage? There was no way Xueqi would deliberately leave the Sunwell behind to nurture a hostile pharaoh, steal Xueqi power, and set the Alliance up, right? In that case, Xueqi would be a first-class moron. Seeing that Xueqi and Sylvanas had gathered the High Elves and were preparing to rush to the Well of the Sun, the silly Kale, that's felt warmth in his heart. Indeed, Xueqi was the eternal best friend of the High Elves. Xueqi didn't know what Kai Z was thinking. If he knew, his reputation as the best actor would fall apart today. Upon hearing that Xueqi wanted to send them away, Kale that's gritted his teeth and made a slightly unreasonable request. Xueqi, before I leave, I hope to see that the Sun Well is fine. Movie Emperor Du's expression was solemn. I can't guarantee anything for the Sun Well. I didn't mean to stall for time. Actually, I did it on purpose. Why don't you bite me? You. Astromancer Caponia was indignant. Her intuition told her that Xueqi wasn't willing to do his best. Kai Z pulled her back. You'll never know how terrifying Arthas is if you haven't faced him face to face. Your Highness, didn't you and Sir Marcus defeat him once? Caponia asked softly. Kale, that's had personally experienced that battle. Both he and Xueqi had bitter expressions on their faces. The Calamity Army's foundation was too strong. In that battle, the Alliance had lost a total of 9 peerless experts. The tribe had lost a famous former Great Chief Orgrim, and the Alliance had lost a Breaking Dawn and Tonidas. In the end, Arthas had still escaped. It was a huge loss. Xueqi explained, defeating a peerless expert and destroying one are 2 completely different things. Moreover, there's information that Arthas became stronger after killing his master, Uther. Otherwise, why do you think His Majesty Anastrian surrendered so easily? The pupils of Kai Zi's followers suddenly shrank. You mean? Antonidas used the power of darkness to suppress the Sun King. The one who really forced the Sun King to surrender was the demigod Arthas. For a moment, the surrounding air fell silent. No one said anything. Finally, Kael'thas's mouth twitched a few times. Gritting his teeth, he suddenly knelt down and said loudly, "Is there no way to stop Arthas' madness? Duque, I know you have the best way. If the Alliance can do its best to help Xueqi this time, my followers and I are willing to be servants of the Marcus family for the rest of our lives." This time, not only was Duque shocked, even the elves who were running around gathering were so frightened that they stopped in their tracks. It was true that with Kael'thas's identity, it was impossible for him to join other forces or serve under someone else in such a despicable way. Although most of the elves united and exiled Kael, that's because of his mistake. Kael, that was no longer a high and mighty prince on formal occasions. But all the elves still recognized Kael, that's as the prince of the high elves. Now that Kael suddenly made such a request, all the elves couldn't help but be in awe. No matter how serious Kael'thas's mistake of choosing sides was, he was willing to sacrifice himself for the future of the elves. Such an act and such a noble sentiment immediately resonated with the majority of the elves. With the great astromancer Solarian, a famous boss in the future as the leader, all of Kael'thas's followers knelt to Duque. This wasn't all of Kai Zi's followers, but there were hundreds of them. It was a spectacular scene to see so many people kneeling in one go. One had to know that Kael'thas's oath was very heavy. He didn't know that Duque was actually immortal. He was completely measuring the lifespan of a human by the lifespan of an elf. In his heart, he was prepared to serve Duque and Duque's descendants for the rest of his life, until his own lifespan came to an end. This time, it was Duque who was dumbfounded. Damn, it was naturally very cool to have a prince of a kingdom as a follower. The problem was that Duque hadn't communicated with William yet. Although Duque firmly believed that William would be as wise and powerful as he was in history, it would be difficult to clean up the mess if his Grand Duke took in a high elven prince as a follower without informing him beforehand. Duque had an idea. Kael'thas. You've caused me so much trouble. I've long prepared a big move against Arthas. Although I wasn't 100% confident, you only came to say that you wanted to be a servant now. If word gets out, it'll be like I've prepared everything before tricking you to be my servant. Chapter 803. Kael'thas's face turned bright red. That's right, Duque always liked to plan before taking action. Previously, they were on different sides, so of course he wouldn't tell the elf if he had a backup plan. Now that he was anxious, yes, he had forced Duque to reveal his backup plan. This was also a big joke. On the other hand, when he forced Duque to reveal his backup plan, it also proved that Duque didn't hide it from him at all. Thinking of this, Kael'thas's heart warmed and he relaxed. Duque! A vow is a vow. Just like how I knelt before my degenerate father before, then I had to take responsibility for the choice I made. It's the same now. If the Alliance goes all out to help Xueqi this time, we lowly exiles will serve you, Duque, for the rest of our lives. What's wrong with that? As long as you, Duque, don't despise us. Behind Kael'thas, a large group of followers shouted in unison, Lord Marcus, please save Xueqi. At that moment, Duque finally understood why so many people complained about being tired, saying that it was hard to raise a bunch of underlings, but at the same time, they eagerly became the boss. Damn. It feels so good to be the boss of a dignified prince. It feels so good to be the boss of a dignified kingdom's prince. Movie Emperor Du said seriously, just now, I received an official request from Xueqi to save the nation. The Alliance is now giving an official response, welcoming Xueqi to rejoin the Alliance. The Alliance's army will also enter the Isle of Quel'Donas to fight against the Scourge army. As for the big move I'm talking about, early on, after the battle between the Dalajan and Arthas, I sent Sir Mograine to the Iron Furnace Castle. There, His Majesty Magni Bronzebeard is building a light-type divine weapon comparable to Frostmourne for Mograine. That divine weapon should be completed by today. Kael'thas had seen the power of Frostmourne. Although it was not to the extent of being able to freeze 1,000 miles with just a slash of the sword, this runic demon sword with the greatest power to date was definitely a great enemy of every living being. Now that Duque had announced that a divine artifact comparable to Frostmourne was being born, Kael'thas could not help but be filled with hope. When Orgrim was still around, the Hammer of Destruction was only a demigod item, and it could only attack and defend against Arthas. Using a divine artifact to deal with a divine artifact was the true way of kings. As long as they could slightly resist the power of Frostmourne, the entire situation would be completely different. Otherwise, every besieger would be afraid of being pulled over by Earthies at any time and killed like chickens and ducks. Who would dare to use a big move? Kale, that's took out a memory crystal. Duque, this is the secret of the Sunwell that I know. Although it's not much, I think it can help you. Duque took it, and the system elf scanned it for him. He immediately knew what was going on. It should be said that it was different from those black and white bear-shaped national treasures that were only responsible for acting cute. The Sunwell was indeed the national treasure of the High Elves, and its defense system was also the best. In Duque's imagination, the Sunwell should have no resistance since even that bastard Anastrian had surrendered. Unfortunately, perhaps because of the change in Kale, that's fate, the latest data showed that the deviation had reached 28%. Azeroth, which was gradually drifting away from history, seemed to have played a joke on Duque. The highest defense system of the Sunwell was actually not in Anastrian's hands. What? The remnant soul of Dethrima? Dethrima Sunstrider was the founding king of the High Elves' kingdom. Even though he had been exiled by his people, he was still a super impressive person who could expand his territory and create a huge stir. Although the Sunstrider royal family was really getting worse with each generation, no one could deny that Dethrima, as the first Sunstrider, was still very impressive. However, Duque did not expect that Dethrima, who was supposed to have died of old age in history, did not return to heaven and earth, and instead became a special existence like a guardian spirit. Duque was dumbfounded. Duque was not the only one. Arthas, who was heading towards the Sunwell at this moment, was also stunned. If Arthas was still alive in the past, he would have already started cursing. The deeper depravity had obliterated his humanity, and Arthas had now lost more than half of his human emotions. He was more like an emotionless war machine. Unfortunately, there was still an emotion called annoyance accumulating in his spiritual world. Crack! There was a thunderous sound. In the beautiful garden of the High Elves' artistic style, a huge statue that was more than 10 meters tall suddenly came to life. The radiance of arcane energy instantly filled every pattern on the statue's body, and it was very beautiful. What had nothing to do with beauty was the powerful destructive power of this arcane puppet. His heavy punches and kicks, measured in tons, could easily put a horde of undyings to rest. The magic lightning that he threw out at the slightest provocation sent many elite demons flying. Arthas had no choice but to use a small number of bone dragons to attack the Sunwell Highland. Regardless of whether it was an arcane puppet or not, he tried to destroy every statue as much as possible. Even though Arthas advanced step by step, there were still endless traps along the way. For example, he once wanted to freeze the entire Sunwell Highland, but who knew that the opponent would directly connect a certain Sunwell Highland with magic power to Arthas' feet? That terrifying power was even more insane than a volcanic eruption, and it directly wiped out a group of Death Knights that belonged to Arthas. Under the persuasion of the demon sword, Arthas finally gave up on using the magic power collected by Frostmourne to directly fight against the power of the Sunwell. No matter who it is, it's obviously afraid. It doesn't have the strength to fight you at all. Be patient, Death Knight. Frostmourne whispered. In the sky above the Isle of Quel'Donas, Antonidas finally found a flaw in Krasus. Icy whirlpool. A gigantic frost tornado large enough to swallow 10 battleships suddenly appeared in the sky. The terrifying suction force comparable to that of a black hole was pulling Krasus' enormous body, trying to drag this magic-proficient giant dragon into the horrifying cold magic vortex and strangle him to death. Krasus flapped his wings frantically but was helplessly pulled back by the suction force. Antonidas let out a proud laugh. Krasus, give up resisting. For the sake of our years of working together, I'm happy to let you join the Calamity Army. Let me think, a Dracolic. Haha. This new identity is very suitable for you. I refuse, Krasus snarled with effort. Don't be in such a hurry to refuse. After you taste the soul torture of Frostmourne, I hope you can still refuse me so stubbornly. Suddenly, Krasus' dragon face revealed a smile. Hey, is it appropriate to put all your energy on me? Chapter 804. What exactly was integrity? This was an extremely mysterious question. A person without integrity was definitely a hooligan. A person full of integrity was probably a saint. But if a person with integrity was always randomly fluctuating, only God knew if he was a human or not. In Antonida's eyes, Xueqi was a collection of super contradictions. He had seen Xueqi, who was full of holiness and was even more saintly than a saint. He had also seen Xueqi, who hid the fact that Deathwing was the Lord of Presto, and even tricked his own leader, Terina's, and the traitorous version of Xueqi who had kidnapped the princess. After all, he had known Xueqi for more than 10 years, and he had known Krasis for more than 30 years. Now that Krasis had suddenly changed his style, and this experienced magic dragon changed his previous strategy. His rich combat experience saved the life of this old mage and new Grand Lich. Attack! Just as expected. Keenly aware of the inconspicuous but real magic fluctuations behind him, Antonidas immediately used Blink to leave where he was. Sure enough, less than 1/10 of a second after he left, a shining golden hand made of magic suddenly appeared where he was just a moment ago. 5 fingers that were condensed with powerful magic quickly closed, but unfortunately, they grabbed nothing. The great power that was enough to instantly crush an ogre into meat paste was useless. This is... Antonidas's ashen face twitched. What a waste. There was no sense of beauty at all. A huge amount of magic was injected into a large model of a hand without any skill. If it wasn't Xueqi who cast the spell, Antonidas would definitely feel the deepest disdain and contempt for this spell that seemed to be only at the level of a magic apprentice. Why did one need to chant to cast a spell? Why did the more powerful the spell, the longer the chanting time? For thousands of years, countless magic apprentices had asked their mentors this question. Third-rate mentors would tell their students that this was how the magic was developed by the predecessors of the path of magic, and that it was not allowed to change. Then, when the students asked questions such as why they could use metamagic abilities to shorten the casting time, they would become speechless. On the other hand, the first-rate academy mages would carefully analyze the components of this spell with their disciples. Opening a tunnel in the elements realm with magic and attracting the elemental power was indeed the core of the spell. But that was not the most important part. The most important part was the additional incantations that shaped the elements, stabilized their characteristics, and indicated their targets. These incantations actually limited the range and function of the magic, making the magic more controllable and safer. However, what Xueqi was doing now had almost overturned most of the magic knowledge and theories. First it was a flaming hand, then 10, then 100. In the beginning it was still barely taking shape, but in the end, it was simply throwing fire elements at Antonidas. It was as if I was the one who had opened the dam. I didn't care how the downstream would be flooded. In the sky, a large stretch of beach near the southeast had turned into a sea of fire. The seawater evaporated, and the high temperature of the steam, which was hot enough to burn and choke mortals to death, filled the entire sky. However, it condensed in an entire area and did not dissipate. With Antonidas as the center, the beach with a radius of more than 5 kilometers was surrounded by a small volcano. The small volcano spewed golden flames into the sky. Antonidas was about to go mad from the indignation. As a veteran Breaking Dawn, even though many of his magic circuits had been stripped away by Xueqi, he still used his rich knowledge and the mana stored in the Dalajan Mage Tower to quickly replenish his lost magic circuits. He could announce without exaggeration that he would not be afraid of any Breaking Dawn mage he met. But now, he felt a tremble from the depths of his soul. For a moment, he almost thought that he was fighting against a Nastrian at his peak, and not a mere radiant moon Xueqi. Impossible! He subconsciously shouted, but immediately slapped his own mouth. But if it's Xueqi? The various miracles of Xueqi in the past surfaced in his mind. He still remembered that in the broken ridge of the Alterac Mountains, Xueqi had borrowed his magic power to create an ice tornado that cut down hundreds and thousands of young red dragons. He could still remember that when he faced the dark portal that even he was afraid of, it was also Xueqi who used his extraordinary control over his power to close the portal that connected the two worlds. He still remembered that when the Dalajan had fallen, the mage towers had suddenly gone out of control, causing the Calamity Army's encirclement to turn into a battle of attrition. Now that he thought about it, Xueqi was not that good in a one-on-one fight, but once he was given power, his battle strength would skyrocket. He could practically fly. At this moment, Antonidas wished that there was medicine for regret in this world. He would definitely buy one even if he had to spend all his fortune. It was a good thing that he and Arthes had forced a Nastrian to surrender. Arthy's advancing at the front and destroying the defenses of the Sunwell Plateau was also a good thing for the Calamity Army. Who would have thought that making the Sunwell lose its core master would instead give Xueqi an opportunity to take advantage of? Without a controller, Xueqi could easily control the mana veins flowing out of the Sunwell. Because of the natural restraints, the two great liches were no match for Xueqi, who had mastered the mana of the Sunwell tributary, even though they had Breaking Dawn mana. They would be so stupid as to give their knives to Xueqi and then offer their necks to him. For a second, Antonidas almost wanted Arthy's to stop advancing and return to deal with Xueqi first. Unfortunately, it was impossible to think about it. Invading the Sunwell was the highest-level mission that the Lich King had ordered. Arthy's would not care no matter how many sacrifices he had to make. He had sensed the Sun King escape just now, and in less than 3 seconds, the Lich King's soul punishment had arrived. Now, the soul circuits of the entire Calamity Army's higher-ups were filled with Anastrian screams. "Xueqi! I'll fight you to the death!" Antonidas roared. He gathered every drop of dark power he could and flashed in the direction that he had sensed. "Fight? How are you going to fight me?" On the beach, at the crater of a huge volcano that was at least 10 stories high, the mana of the Sunwell, which could not be measured, was spewing out crazily. Miraculously, almost every trace of the mana bypassed Xueqi, who was in the middle of the crater. It brushed past Xueqi and sprayed into the air before transforming into various forms and smashing at Antonidas. Chapter 805. If Antonidas' ice attack was a steady song of death, then Xueqi flame combo was the wildest jazz. At this moment, it wasn't just Xueqi who was fighting. The entire Isle of Quel'Danas was burning with the flames of war. On the west coast of the island, the Alliance launched an offensive that exceeded the imagination of the Calamity Army. Led by the peak radiant moon mage Gina Jinjian, the mages from various countries joined forces to cast spells and followed Xueqi's instructions to create a path of ice. After the spacious and slow troop ships approached the coast, they spent a large number of magic crystals to seal the sea between the troop ships and the coast. Praise life! For this world not to be occupied by death. Burn those damned bones 1,000 times over. The Scarlet Cross under the leadership of General Abendis became the first Marine Corps in the history of the world of Azeroth. The blood-red tide drowned the snow-white surface of the ice and directly rushed into the undead camp that had been plowed into pieces by the cannons. Battle cries shook the heavens and earth. Dense black cannonballs covered the sky like raindrops, and on the golden beach, countless soldiers in red armor trampled on the rotten bones that had been smashed and swarmed forward. It was unclear whether it was the angry shouts of humans or the low cries of the undead. Lich Ras Frostwhisper, who had just been resurrected by Arthas and was entrusted with a heavy responsibility, tried his best to control the situation, but he was shocked by an unexpected situation. It was a paladin whose body was as red as the rising sun. He waved a super great sword that looked like a giant blade, and every swing of it blocked the terrifying radiance that was as bright as the sun, turning large swathes of the undead into ashes. The elite undead legion that Ras had commanded to go up when the cannons stopped were directly cut in half like butter being cut by a sharp knife. The 2-meter-tall holy light giant horse emitted a golden radiance as it charged towards him as if it was galloping in a racetrack. Repentance! With the support of the terrifying great sword, the paladin's control skill, which had a very close range, crossed the void of 100 meters and landed on Ras's head. Suddenly, the power of holy light poured into Rhys's evil soul, causing him to feel dizzy and unable to move at all. When he came back to his senses, he saw a holy knight wrapped in golden flames sitting on a warhorse that looked like the rising sun. The holy knight had already arrived in front of him and was looking down at him from above. Those eyes that seemed to be burning with flames made his heart palpitate. "Perish, you filthy soul!" Accompanied by an intimidating roar, the great sword cleaved through Lichless vision. The burning pain that followed caused Rhys's soul to let out his last miserable howl in this world. In theory, as long as the phylactery was not destroyed, a lich could resurrect again and again through the phylactery. The premise of this theory was that the lich's soul had not been damaged. However, this shockingly powerful light elemental sword had completely overturned the laws of physics that swords and sabers were unable to harm souls. The powerful holy light attached to it completely burned Ras Frostwhisper's soul, erasing this evil soul from this world. Almost at the same time, the undead army on the beach fell into chaos. They still tried their best to attack every living being, but they lacked coordination. In front of the well-organized and experienced human elites, they were no different from training targets. Long live! Well done! All hail Lord Mograine! All the Scarlet Cross warriors from Lordaeron and the knights from the Silver Hand cheered in unison. That's right. The one who easily killed Ras Frostwhisper was the deputy commander of the Alliance, Alexandros Mograine, who had just returned from Iron Furnace Castle. The holy greatsword in his hand, which looked a little like a broadsword with a square head, was the original sword that had changed hands several times in history. It was the sword that had wandered between light and darkness, and was finally wielded by the legendary paladin Tyrion Fordring, who had destroyed Arthese's Frostmourne. It was the Ashbringer. The undead army fell apart on the beach, and the black war flags fell one after another. Seeing this scene, Mograine knew that he had won the first battle. Alessandro! General Abendis excitedly urged his horse forward. Alfred, I'm starting to understand why Commander Marcus wanted me to go to Iron Furnace Castle. In the past, when they talked about Duque, Mograine and Abendis would call him by his name because they were familiar with each other. Today they used honorifics. You're so lucky. The stone in your hand is actually a top-grade light stone. Now we should be able to fight Arthas fair and square. Abendis waved the new greatsword in his hand. Although it was not a demigod weapon, it was still a top-grade epic weapon. Similarly, it was a holy weapon that Magni Bronzebeard had forged. Really? Lucky? No. Alfred. I don't think so. Do you still remember Mediv? When he turned into a crow and came to warn us, we scolded him for being a dirty liar and an unqualified charlatan. Who knew? This? It seems that Karazhan's wizards have a magical ability to foresee. In the face of Mograine's exclamation, Abendis was speechless for a moment. Mograine waved his hand. After all, this is just speculation. I have no evidence. There is also no need to prove it. After all, the legendary prophets who are proficient in prophecy will pay a high price when peering into the future. We just need to know that Sir Marcus can lead us to victory. That's right. On the southeast coast of the island, gorgeous elven warships, regardless of model, all rushed to the beach. Feeling the impact coming from under her feet, a strong and beautiful figure followed the powerful momentum and directly swooped down like a giant eagle, descending on the beach. Just as she descended, more than 36 arrows containing the power of wind and lightning burst out, and a total of 18 of the most threatening giant crypt fiends fell in response. Sylvanas suddenly raised his longbow, and a clear and melodious shout spread in all directions. For Quell Dorii. The follow-up troops that landed burst into thunderous shouts in unison. For the glory of the sun. An assault group of nearly 30,000 elves. Although the number was small, their strength was definitely not to be underestimated. It was no exaggeration to say that this was already the last elite of the High Elves, and also the strongest elite. Mixed with a large number of huge arcane puppets, the momentum of this elven army was no weaker than the human coalition on the other side of the island. Chapter 806. Ras Frostwhisper, that idiot, failed again? There was not a trace of blood on his elegant face. He was draped in a black knight's cloak and wielded a crimson greatsword. His blue-black armor was suffused with a black deathly aura, and he was riding a skeletal warhorse with 2 white goat horns. A terrifying figure appeared on top of a small hill in the southeast of the beach. Following that, more figures with similar appearances appeared. They were the core forces under Arthas, the Death Knights led by Baron Rivendare. A vanguard with arcane puppets as the arrowheads. Rivendare sneered as he put on his gauntlets. This is the trump card of those long-eared creatures. Let's go, I want a calamitous victory. For His Majesty the Lich King. Behind him, the Death Knights in black armor unsheathed their gleaming swords. Their deep-set eyes glowed red as they replied in unison. By the will of Nazul. They charged. The seemingly weak skeletal warhorses possessed unimaginable agility and strength. They carried heavy armor and carried a fully armored knight, yet their movements were comparable to those of apes. Normally, heavy knights wouldn't like a sandy battlefield, but in front of the skeletal warhorses, it was no different from flat ground. The giant arcane puppets that shook the earth with every step turned into clumsy puppets in front of the Death Knights. The Death Knights used their dark magic and superior weapons to quickly dismantle the war machines that the High Elves were so proud of. In the name of the Holy Light, it was clear that ordinary elven warriors and rangers were defenseless in front of the Death Knights. A high-ranked paladin, Rhiadaline, led the Silver Hand Paladins to the front lines. This made Rivendare frown, but he soon revealed a smile. Paladins. It's the fall of paladins that makes it interesting. The more devout a paladin was, the more powerful they would become when they fell. With Arthas as an example, the Lich King had spread this hint within the Scourge. If they could drag the strongest paladin down, the Scourge would also have the strongest Death Knights. More than one Undying looked at the 7 Silver Sages. It was a pity that the 7 Silver Saints weren't just any Tom, Dick, and Harry. Other than Uther Sol, who had died in battle, and Tyrion and Gavin Rad, who were still trapped in Karazhan, Bolvar, Reginald, Sidon, and Turalyon, were mostly commanders who led large armies whenever they went out. Below them were the likes of Mograine and Abendis, who were equally difficult to deal with. Now that Rivendell had discovered a high elven paladin whose aptitude was not below that of the 7 Silver Sages, he was excited to hunt him down. Noiselessly, Rivendell's skeletal warhorse that was coveted by countless players in Duzay's world began to accelerate. That was an extremely fast speed. What was even more unfathomable was that Rivendell was able to become one with his mount after accelerating to the limit. Using the shadows of his Death Knights as cover, he was able to shuttle through the shadows. Hammer of Wrath. Channeling the holy light in her body, Rhiadaline smashed a Death Knight and his horse into smithereens with a single swing of her hammer. But just as she was about to unleash a new attack, Rivendell's crimson two-handed sword arrived. It was an angle that she would never have noticed. Just a tenth of a second ago, her comrade, a male paladin with long golden hair, was standing there. But the blade of the sword avoided the paladin's neck and pierced through the back of his hair, aiming for Rhiadaline's carotid artery. Divine Shield. Rhiadaline, who had no time to dodge or block, immediately tried to activate the paladin's life-saving skill. But she was a step too late. Her vision was filled with illusions of terrifying existences baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. It was obvious that she was ambushed by a powerful warlock. With the power of the holy light and her extraordinary willpower, the power of fear was not too strong. It only affected her movements slightly. In a battle between experts, there was only a fine line of difference. This fine line could mean the difference between life and death. Just as she was about to be struck by the sword, Rhiadaline saw the existence that ambushed her. It was the psychic Dean Gatling, another powerful enemy ranked by the Alliance. He was no longer a human, but a lich. Everything seemed to have nothing to do with Rhiadaline because she was about to die, and if a miracle didn't happen, it was a bolt of lightning that fell from the 9 heavens. In the nick of time, the first thing that arrived was the dazzling purple lightning. After a full second of delay, the ear-shattering explosion rang out. Bang! Rumble. Double shot. But they hit the targets at different distances at the same time. Dean Gatling used flash to dodge half of the attack, but in the midst of the flickering light, he was still hit. Half of his robe was blown to pieces, revealing a skeletal body that only had bones left. Rivendell didn't have it any better either. One of the undead warhorse's horns was blown off. The undead warhorse couldn't withstand the destructive power and was sent flying, throwing Rivendell out. Savannahs. The female paladin cried out in surprise. The agile Death Knight didn't seem to give up and used a dark spell on Rhiadaline. But the female paladin recovered and used holy light to negate the spell. Kill that female ranger first. Gatling shouted. Rivendell changed his target and charged at Savannahs. Their choices were usually correct. Compared to the paladins, who had thick skin, could heal themselves, and were invincible, rangers were too weak. If it was an ordinary ranger, the combination of the Death Knight and Pharaoh would definitely be a nightmare. Rivendell ran over and stretched out his left hand, attempting to use the power of darkness to pull Savannahs over. Unfortunately, he failed. According to Savannah's movements, his arm turned 12 times. In fact, the high-speed Savannahs changed directions a total of 36 times. Her speed was so fast that only a series of illusory afterimages were left behind. And every time she changed directions, 3 lightning bolts would be shot out. 2 were for Gatling and Rivendell, and 1 was for the Death Knight who wanted to get involved in this pinnacle confrontation. These elite Death Knights were powerful enough to take on 100 enemies at once. Unfortunately, the one in front of them was the stronger Savannahs. Gatling couldn't hold on any longer after the 12th arrow. From the 20th arrow onwards, his body began to explode from the lightning. The remaining 16 arrows were more like a whipping of a corpse. Rivendell wasn't much better off. He could split apart the arrows, but he couldn't block the powerful lightning bolts. By the time he recovered from the paralysis effect of the lightning, he discovered that a bowstring as bright as the moon was already stuck to his neck. In the next instant, a rather handsome head was sent flying into the sky. Chapter 807. Seeing that their boss was so powerful, the elven army, which had been in a mess due to the Death Knight's counterattack and was about to collapse, suddenly burst into cheers. Bones' leader is dead. Hadgeron did not expect to hear Lord Themar shout, "Long live Sylvanas!" and "Long live the goddess of war!" His shouts were immediately echoed by the elves. "Long live Sylvanas!" Such voices echoed throughout the entire beach. Standing on the high hill, Sylvanas stood against the wind. The thick clouds seemed to have thinned due to the fall of the two commanders of the Scourge army. A ray of golden sunlight shone through the gaps in the clouds and shone on Sylvanas, making her look great. It was as if a god had descended, an irresistible visual impact for mortals. Ah! The goddess of war! The goddess of war! The goddess of war! The elf's fighting spirit was obviously burning. Hadgeron quickly flashed to Lord Themar's side and grabbed his friend's shoulder. "Lord Themar, you!" Unexpectedly, Lord Themar pulled him over and whispered into his ear, "Isn't this good? The kingdom is falling. Our king and prince have betrayed their subjects and want to push all elves into the abyss of death. We may be able to hold on for a while, but what next? The high elves need a hero, a flag, a leader." Hadgeron's eyes narrowed. He completely understood what his friend meant, and his breathing quickened. "Actually, if it's Aurelia..." His meaning was clear. If the kingdom had to have a new queen, then the steady and magnanimous Aurelia was undoubtedly more suitable. They're both Windrunner sisters. I don't think there's much difference for Duke Marcus. Plus, the one standing here at the moment of the kingdom's fall is Sylvanas. To be a hero, one needed strength, timing, and luck. Perhaps Aurelia was more suitable, but she was currently trapped in the void of Karazhan, and she did not have the royal bloodline, so the people would only recognize Sylvanas, who had stood up for them when they were at their most desperate. It wasn't Aurelia who had a better personality and was more suitable, nor was it Kael, who had once bent his knees. Moreover, with the relationship between Duke and the Windrunner sisters, no matter which of them ascended to the throne, they would definitely receive the full support of the alliance. This was of utmost importance to the extremely weak Xueqi Salas. After thinking quickly, Hadgeron finally nodded. At this moment, Sylvanas, who was wholeheartedly focused on the battle, did not know that the two subordinates she relied on the most were ready to help her ascend the throne. She was fighting with all her heart. When the armies of the Alliance and the Elves successfully occupied the beach and sent reinforcements to shore, the commanders of both sides saw a red and gold flood converging together as the battle line advanced. 13 years. There had been arguments. There was filth. There had been enmity. They had thought that differences in ideals and escalating skirmishes at the border would eventually lead to war. After all, there were countless examples of such things in history. Who would have thought that today, the kings of both Lordaeron and Xueqi Salas were dead? Grand Duke Mograine held Ashbringer in his hand as he stood amidst the crimson torrent of Rotterdam's heavy cavalry, staring at the golden formation not far away. The one in the lead was a valiant goddess of war with a bow slung over her back and riding a white chocobo. Mograine muttered to himself, "What the hell, don't tell me that both countries will have a queen." The humans already knew about Quell the Loss, but sometimes the so-called official business was just like that. Under the command, the knight who passed the order raised a flag of inquiry, a blue flag of the Alliance, and pointed to the north. "Are we still allies?" The elves did not hesitate, immediately raising a holy flag with golden edges and a white background. On the flag, there was a pair of tightly clenched hands, one of the elves and the other of the humans. That was the flag that the former Sun King Anastrian and Thoradin the Great had decided to use when they formed an alliance 2,800 years ago. This flag only meant one thing. The holy oath was still in effect. The two armies were getting closer and closer. Mograine and Sylvanas saw each other. They were not familiar with each other. They had met a few times, but they had never talked in detail. However, they had experienced the second battle at the Dark Portal together and had no grudges against each other, so they were familiar with each other. "When do we attack north?" Sylvanas asked anxiously. The elves were going all out, but their power was still limited. The alliance was still the key. Mograine glanced at the dwarven steam tanks that were driving onto the beach, then retracted his gaze and looked at the dazzling magic battle in the distance. It'll be hard for us to push forward until the battle above is decided. The scourge was easy to deal with, but their gazes fell on the battle between the two top wizards in the world. Battle power that surpassed mortals could not be ignored. It was just like 13 years ago at the Earthy Highlands. Nearly 300,000 troops had been unable to advance because of the fierce attack of the Red Dragon Legion. If they could not defeat the enemy's Breaking Dawn, then even if the allied army of the Alliance and the Elves succeeded in stopping Arthas, they would have to pay a heavy price. This was an extraordinary confrontation between a newly advanced Breaking Dawn Grand Wizard, Duke Marcus, and a veteran Breaking Dawn expert, Antonidas. It was not that Antonidas did not try to call for help in this battle, but whether it was the two former Kirin Tor counselors who had fallen to become liches or the Radiant Moon Warlock from the Cursing Sect, they were all stopped by the Alliance. Krasus, who had returned to his human form, Dellen's old lover Gina Jinjian, and Duque's fiancée Jaina Proudmoore all joined the battle, entangling the evil mystics. This made Antonidas feel bitter. Mortals always thought that Breaking Dawn was the strongest in the world. Every magic mystics envied Breaking Dawn wizards who had an endless supply of mana like the sun. Only those who had reached the Breaking Dawn realm would understand that even Breaking Dawn wizards were divided into ranks. The Breaking Dawn symbolized the son of dawn, and the sun was the standard star in astronomy. According to the ranking of magic from ancient times, with reference to the brightness of the star, a Breaking Dawn wizard was only a rank 6 Breaking Dawn. The strongest rank 1 Breaking Dawn was 100 times stronger than a rank 6 Breaking Dawn. Antonidas, who had just returned to rank 5 after his magic circuit had been stolen, felt like he had run into the real sun. Chapter 808. The cold wind blew the black snowflakes, and the dense power of darkness descended from the sky, colliding with the golden sand on the ground that contained fiery magic power in the air. In the sky, the scattered black clouds were quickly gathering again. The canopy of the undead existed to isolate the light of the sun and prevent the weather from affecting the Scourge army. After all, a hot sun would accelerate the decay of corpses and reduce the combat power of undead creatures such as ghouls. Now, for only one reason, the Lich King had gathered his power. Your Majesty Nazul, now your great enemy, Duke Marcus, controls part of the power of the sun well. I, who am weak, am no match for him. Please bestow upon me the power to destroy your enemy. In Nazul's heart, Arthas, who had the most perfect aptitude and whose soul had fallen into the darkest hell, was his ideal spokesperson and the carrier of his future body. In the entire Scourge army, Nazul had been trying to cultivate Arthas' authority. Logically speaking, this kind of behavior of directly asking for power without Arthas was not allowed. When he heard the name Duque deeply pierced his heart, evoking the memory that he did not want to recall in the depths of his soul. If not for Duque's obstruction, he might have succeeded when he opened the dark portal for the second time. He would have been able to escape to a place where Kil Jaden's perception could not reach. Perhaps it was a corner of the universe, or a planet in a bad situation. No matter which one it was much better than now. After all, Kil Jaden was not an omniscient and omnipotent god. If he had been a step earlier, maybe, he would not have ended up in such an embarrassing state. After suffering all kinds of torture, even his soul was bitterly sealed in an ice skeleton, becoming a puppet of the Burning Legion. Nazul hated it. He changed his mind. In front of the coalition army of the High Elves, the undead creatures fell in large numbers. They were like dried corpses that had their blood sucked dry by vampires, and then after 1,000 years of sun, rain and wind erosion, they actually carbonized and dissipated in the wind. Mograine, Servanas, and the others were tongue-tied. They suddenly had a very bad premonition. Undead creatures wouldn't court death. Their own death could only mean one thing. Their master wanted them to be destroyed. Even for the Calamity Troop, which had no regard for capital, this was not a price that could be easily paid. And so Nazul did. What he got in return was the terrifying figure in midair whose aura had skyrocketed. A quarter of an hour ago, Antonida's attacks were unable to advance. In the next second, the magic power around Antonidas skyrocketed. It was the dark energy squeezed out from hundreds of thousands of undead creatures and spirits.
This terrifying power was so dense that it dyed the sky with a diameter of more than 10 kilometers black with the Great Lich as the center.
At first glance, it looked like an incomparably huge lump of black mud that was still constantly churning. Humans, elves, dwarves. Everyone who witnessed this scene revealed expressions of fear. The air became heavy, and all that was left was the sound of the mortals trying their best to suppress their gasps. Was this still an enemy that mortals could fight against? Suddenly, Sylvanas raised the reins, and the chocobo beneath her let out a loud screech. "What are you doing?" Mograine asked immediately. "Attack." Sylvanas answered proudly. "Wait. Duque called us."
"Yes. He's the commander.
But he's facing Antonidas, not Arthas. The Sunwell is under threat. And because we refuse to wait for death.
That's why we're here."
Mograine and Abendis were speechless for a moment, but then they understood. Duque's old habit was acting up again. As a commander, he was almost perfect and picky. But in the alliance, there was a saying, Duque always liked to pay the smallest price, and then fight for the biggest victory under this premise. A leader who cherished his subordinates could easily gain the love and respect of his subordinates. Most of the time, one could not win just by cherishing their subordinates. This was a terrifying opponent that had destroyed 2 of the Alliance's kingdoms and swept through most of the continent. It was an opponent that could never be defeated by sheer attrition. Mograine and Abendis looked at each other and smiled. Then Mograine raised the huge Ashbringer, in his hand high. "Brothers, why are we here? Isn't it all for the sake of killing our beloved King Tyrrhenas, the fallen demon Arthas? Those who don't have the courage to face death, get back on the ships now. The rest of you, follow me." Sylvanas gave Mograine an admiring look. She also raised the bow in her hand.
"For our son, for Quel'Dor with a determination to fight, the 200,000-strong army rolled north, chasing after Arthas with no intention of turning back." Feeling the movement of the army around him, Duque laughed.
"Those guys. But that's good. Only like this is the Queen Sylvanas I love." Facing the world of Azeroth that was becoming more and more biased, Duque always felt a little troubled. No intervention. If those tragic scenes were to repeat themselves, he wouldn't be able to bear it. Intervention. It would often lead to all kinds of unpredictable events. He was always worried that those great heroes who were originally famous in history would grow old and become useless. He was also afraid that because of the changes he experienced, he would no longer be he, and she would no longer be she. He was afraid that the best wishes in his heart would be different from reality, and he would not be able to adapt. Now, with the help of the system's telescopic function, Duque saw Mograine riding forward on a warhorse in order to kill evil. He saw Sylvanas with her blonde hair flying in the wind. Duque suddenly felt a real sense of spirit. What was a hero? Heroes were abstract and vague. There was never an accurate definition of a hero. But every time there was a disaster, when a seemingly weak figure stood up for his compatriots and did not hesitate to charge at a seemingly invincible enemy, their figure would overlap with the legendary hero. This was indeed an era of heroes. Looking at Antonidas, who was attacking wildly with his surging power, and feeling the vast and boundless dark magic that far surpassed even the branch of the Sunwell, Duque's lips curled into a smile. This smile suddenly gave Antonidas a bad feeling. Could it be? Duque still had a trump card? Yo! Antonidas, do you think I haven't learned any new tricks after staying in the void for 10 years? Chapter 809. How many decades do you have in your life? Even though Duque was theoretically immortal and had an endless lifespan, he did not have a decade to squander in a world as dangerous as Azeroth. When Duque encountered a bottleneck in his training in Karazhan and could not advance, Duque could live a depraved life of threesome every day. Even Alex Strassa once said to Duque, "You're too impatient. Not only do you lack the accumulation of mana, but you also lack the proficiency and experience to use mana. I know you're a genius, but no matter how much of a genius you are, you can't do what mortals need 100 years to do in 10 years. Duque shook his head, but he did not give up and continued to work hard. Didn't you see the situation in the later stages of history where demigods were as common as dogs and ancient gods were everywhere? Didn't you see even the creation titans kneeling one after another? Didn't you see almost all the dragon aspects perish? But Duque did not. It was this foresight that filled him with a thirst for power all year round. Unable to accumulate more mana and change the mana in his body from quantitative to qualitative, Xueqi quietly thought about his own path. Am I really a gifted genius mage who specializes in some kind of magic and has a body of frost and body of fire? Am I a true master of magic, a master of learning who can understand any magic, no matter how long, obscure, or incredible it is? Am I the lucky star who has great luck, wins big prizes every day, has fortuitous encounters every week, and opens treasure troves every year? Am I the lucky star who can do everything? Every time he asked himself, the answer was no. Then how did I get to such a high position? There were only two answers. One was the deep memory of the original history as a transmigrator. The other was the omnipotent system elf in terms of data. As a powerful mage who had fought at least 1,000 duels in front of the Steel Stove Castle in the game, Duke could be said to have beaten up warriors, thieves, and hunters. In fact, he had fought almost all of the 9 main classes. Except for a certain despicable priest who was willing to plant a flag on the edge of the Furnace Castle's cliff and try to use mind control to throw Duke down the cliff when the duel started, apart from those shameless warlocks who were only willing to bring hellhounds with high magic resistance to duels with wizards. Xueqi had never been afraid of anyone. At the end of the day, there was only one conclusion. The essence of a mage was never in their ability to deal damage, but in their control. When it came to controlling the enemy, combined with his greatest advantage, the system elves, what could be born? The answer was obvious. If it was said that whoever had more strength would be the winner in a battle, then there was no need to fight at all. Everyone who fought in melee would compete with their muscles, and those who used magic would compete with their magic power. The winner could immediately show off, and the loser would be kicked out on the spot. Xueqi narrowed his eyes and stared coldly at the sky. Supported by an icy mist, Antonidas stood proudly in the air. When he heard that Xueqi had practiced a new move, he also laughed. New move? Very good. I want to see what kind of new move you, a genius wizard who has never had a master and reached the peak of the Radiant Moon Realm on your own, can come up with. You won't be disappointed. Xueqi smiled calmly. Humph. At this moment, the dark clouds in the sky suddenly moved, and an icy pillar of light descended like lightning. It landed on the Great Lich's body, as if it had draped an incomparably large ice robe with sparkling snowflakes coiled around it. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The Great Lich's robe sleeves fluttered in the wind. This breaking dawn spell that was about to be cast seemed to contain the might of heaven and earth. Even the Radiant Moon wizards fighting thousands of meters away could clearly feel that the fire element in the atmosphere was being rapidly drawn away. No, perhaps it was being repelled. In short, there was not a single drop of fire element left in the area where Xueqi and Antonidas were fighting. The power that Xueqi had drawn from the branch vein of the sun well dissipated in less than 1/100th of a second after reaching the surface. I'd like to see how a mere Radiant Moon wizard like you can withstand my most powerful spell without any external support. Antonidas' roar reverberated in the surroundings, and he pointed at Xueqi with a withered finger. Go! Go! What do you mean go? Everyone's doubts were immediately answered. Suddenly, a wolf's howl came from the sky. In less than 3 seconds, the echoing howls filled the sky, and the distant howls seemed to be approaching them at an astonishing speed. In just a moment, the howls seemed to be right next to their ears. The sky started to tremble. It was clearly impossible for any creature to run or walk in the sky, but everyone could hear the sound of galloping horses. Mograine, who was leading his army forward, pulled on the reins of his warhorse and stopped it. The middle-aged paladin who wasn't wearing a helmet couldn't help but change his expression. It wasn't just him and the knights around him who stopped at the same time. Even the High Elves' army stopped in their tracks, and more than 200,000 people looked in the direction of the howls. A pack of snow-white wolves. To the people who lived in the land of ice, snow wolves were not rare. However, ordinary wolves could not fly. Even those who clearly knew what kind of creature the howls came from could not be sure. It was a pack of wolves soaring in the sky, weaving back and forth and drawing dazzling white lines in the air. Just based on their form, they were Northren's wargs. However, their bodies were larger than horses, and the cold mana that lingered around them made it hard for anyone to be certain. If anything went wrong, the legends of these terrifying creatures would spread throughout the entire Eastern Kingdom from today onwards. Northren's wargs weren't scary. A simple blizzard spell wasn't scary either. However, when Antonidas used blizzard to smash out countless icicles, and every icicle had the soul of a warg, they knew how to attack in groups, find flaws, and attack in groups.
Coupled with the terrifying dark mana that the Lich King had bestowed upon them, the power of this combination was more than 100 times greater than that of a mere wolf pack.
Duque.
If you don't want to die in the wolves' mouths and be torn to pieces before being painfully resurrected as a lich, you should obediently submit to His Majesty the Lich King.
Antonidas shouted. Duque burst out laughing. I'm not going to submit to someone who was defeated by me.
Humph.
Don't blame me then. More than 100 Northrend wargs brazenly pounced on Duque. As they pounced, Duque lightly grabbed with his hand, and the world around him trembled slightly. Duque's mana wasn't strong, but it was as if he had grabbed the strings of a puppet, and the dozens of giant wolves dissipated in the air. Chapter 8:10.
The giant frost wolves flying in the sky seemed to have their own souls and clear will, but in reality, all control was still in Antonidas's hands. A thread invisible to the naked eye, and not belonging to elemental sensing, extended from Antonidas's soul to the giant wolf's body.
That was the thread of the soul realm.
Now, Duque had broken all the soul threads with a single hand.
It wasn't that Duque had destroyed the giant frost wolves, but that the self-destruction spell formation on the giant wolves had been forced to activate. Once they lost control, they would self-destruct. This was a common tactic used by most summoners. Who would have thought that Duque would use this to his advantage? But how did Duque do this?
Antonidas was momentarily stunned. His turbid eyeballs kept turning as he adjusted his spiritual vision, trying to see the truth from the elemental undulations and other characteristics that Duque was releasing.
No.
In reality, Antonidas had already sensed that it was that move.
He just couldn't be sure.
That move was too cruel for a mage, and the price was too high. Apart from those who had no hope of improving themselves, no mage would choose that path. They had once been comrades on the same side, but now they had to face each other. Antonidas didn't have the luxury to consider Duque's position. His boss's boss, the Lich King Nazul, had allowed him to borrow the dark power of the Scourge army. This definitely wasn't without a price. This was an enormous dark power that could temporarily suppress the entire branch of the Sun Well. Even if Antonidas was just a transit point, it was still difficult for him. It was just a swimming pool, but it had to contain an entire lake's worth of water. Even if it was only temporary, the entire pool might rot if things went wrong. Antonidas could only abandon all distracting thoughts and focus on shaping his mana before throwing it at Duque. If one were to ask what was the greatest difference between two veteran Breaking Dawns, Anastrian gave Duque the feeling that he was a cannon of the largest caliber. Every move he made was earth-shattering. Antonidas, on the other hand, was like an unimaginable encyclopedia of magic. Almost all the magic that was mentioned in the textbooks, or the unpopular secret techniques, could be seen in his hands. He was not casting the spell on his own. Since he was a great lich, he had the means of a great lich. After a series of strange and dark spells, delicate but terrifying faces appeared on Antonidas' shoulder ornaments, arm guards, and robes. They were the faces of the high elven mages. Duque suddenly understood why a few members of the Silver Moon Parliament and a large number of courtmasters of the Sun-Chasing King Court were missing from the Sun King's side just now. So they were all here, in the form of imprisoned and painful souls. Every face seemed to be struggling to get away from Antonidas. They were destined to fail. That was the darkest and most depraved magic. Their souls had already been firmly bound. Their eyelids could be seen on every face, their eyelids sewn shut by rough rune threads. Unable to open his eyes and unable to break free, he could only rely on his remaining mouth to scream and vent his pain. Soon, under Antonidas's spell, their will was suppressed, and nearly 10 mouths began to chant at the same time. In an instant, it was no longer limited to ice wolves, but all kinds of magic. In the distance, countless water elementals with inverted triangles stood at the end of the horizon like trees. Without legs, they were still silent even when moving at high speed. The whole army was silent like a monstrous water wall that slowly pressed down on Duque. That was the Water Elemental Legion. Antonidas had never liked fire magic, but it did not mean that he did not know how to use it. A high elf's face glowed with fire, and he finished chanting the last incantation. Then, brilliant flames poured down from the void. 2 dozens of golden rivers of flames hung upside down on the dome. Immediately, they formed a whirling fire tornado, sweeping from behind Duque. Spreading along the tornado were flames that scorched the ground.
The sand on the beach that was touched made sizzling sounds, and the ultra-high temperature completely melted the sand, forming a translucent, glass-like molten substance. Flaming storm. Before the previous 2 group magic attacks arrived, a powerful direct attack spell was indispensable. Countless dazzling purple-blue lights streaked across the sky like a meteor shower, directly hitting the place where Xueqi was. Super arcane barrage. Antonidas raised his black skull staff, and a pitch-black light curtain immediately rose behind him. Shadows floated on the light curtain, emitting an ominous aura of decay. At the same time, black, translucent skeletal hands appeared around him. The next moment, all the spiritual skeletal hands disappeared, and when they reappeared, they were already within a radius of less than 20 meters around Xueqi. On each skeletal hand, a black index finger pointed at Xueqi, and rays of terrifying black spiritual light instantly crossed space and landed on Xueqi's body. Curse of the 12 Movements of Dusk. Also, more than 100 flaming hands rose in unison, releasing destructive flames toward Xueqi. 100 hands sacrifice. Suddenly, disgusting barks came from the distance. A moment later, countless dog-like monsters on the beach approached Xueqi at an alarming speed, one after another, echoing each other in unison. In just the blink of an eye, the hellhounds with red and black stripes, 2 ridiculous black beards and 2 white horns appeared. The ground began to tremble, and it was even more shocking than 10,000 horses galloping. This was a wizard's nightmare. Group summoned Cerberus. Apart from these, there were many more. Wizard's ice, fire and arcane spells, warlock's pain, destruction, and demonic spells. Antonidas used the enslaved Radiant Moon Wizard's souls to unleash all his Breaking Dawn spells in one go. At this moment, all the mortals who witnessed this scene cried out in shock. Gina Gold's sword covered her mouth. Krasis tried to help Xueqi, but when he transformed into his dragon form again, he was held back. Gina could no longer care about holding back. She directly used one of her trump cards, a few magic tools. The magic sealed in the tools sent a Kirin Tor counselor in front of her flying. But just as she flashed over, she was surrounded by several extremely powerful 3-headed Cerberus, unable to advance an inch. Servanas knocked his bow and shot a rain of arrows at the main battlefield. Unfortunately, it was like trying to put out a burning cart of firewood with a cup of water. Everyone thought that Xueqi was in trouble, but at this moment, an absolutely confident smile appeared on Xueqi's face. "Hey, old friend. If I really go all out, you might kneel." Chapter 8:11. Xueqi didn't hide his methods. The experienced Antonidas also saw what Xueqi's trump card was. Unfortunately, the most helpless and desperate thing in the world was not knowing what the enemy was doing to you, but knowing what the enemy was going to do to you, but you couldn't stop it. If you didn't know what the enemy was up to, you could still comfort yourself by saying that you were careless and made a mistake. The other party had crushed you fair and square. This was the most intense sense of defeat in the truest sense of the word. Xueqi made his move. It wasn't his hand. There were strange cries of "oh la 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 la," magician's hand, kept appearing around Duke's body before disappearing again and again. Accompanying this process was the magic circle that appeared out of thin air and floated around Duke's body. Almost every magic array disappeared in a flash. They were as bright as fireworks and as short as shooting stars. However, the destruction of each mage hand and magic array would definitely cause one of Antonidas' spells to collapse. A group of 12 mage hands collapsed. Then, the white circle of ice crystals around Antonidas disappeared for some reason and then appeared around Xueqi. Gina Goldsword's bright pupils suddenly constricted, and she couldn't help but cry out, "Spell steal?" Spell steal, as the name suggested, was to transfer beneficial spells from the enemy to oneself or the nearby enemy units. It could also transfer harmful magic effects from the enemy to the nearby enemy units. It sounded like this move could benefit oneself at the expense of others. It was very powerful and high-end. In fact, the more advanced the mage was, the more difficult it was to use this move. It was not easy to steal other people's spells in the first place. Moreover, different mages' magic circuits had different specializations and enhancements. Plus, the source of magic power that supported the buff spell was different. If one was not careful, the buff effect could be stolen at any time, and it could become a poison to oneself. If one was slightly better, it could easily disrupt one's rhythm and break the circulation efficiency of one's magic circuit. Therefore, this move was not as good as others thought. Duque, are you crazy? Did you really change your class? Antonida's mouth was so wide open that a duck's egg could be stuffed in it. Considering his rotting joints, the others were really worried if he could close his mouth after opening it wide. Right. Apart from ordinary mages normally, only one class could do this perfectly. If they were not sure at first, what happened next immediately made every knowledgeable senior mage more certain of their judgment. 100 hands sacrificial. As flame was like using a match to start a fire in the middle of a freezing winter. The flame was extinguished as soon as it appeared. When the super arcane barrage was 10 meters away from Duke, it disappeared like raindrops falling onto the surface of a lake after a series of ripples appeared. It was the curse of the 12 movements of dusk, which was the most terrifying name for mages. The black smoke of the curse had clearly attached itself to Duke's body, but after being hit, all the curses were like stones sinking into the sea, never to be heard again. Crace's huge dragon mouth finally spat out a few unbelievable words. It's actually magic immunity. Magic immunity sounded amazing, but in fact, for a mage, it was not necessarily a good thing. Magic immunity was nothing more than a magic defense system that rejected certain elements with superb skills. But if you were immune, it meant that even you could not use this element. Now, Duque actually eliminated fire and arcane in one go, and used a certain method to resist the curse of pain. As a normal mage, the only elemental element he could use was the frost element. Antonidas had been famous for his frost since he was young. Could it be that Duque wanted to fight this veteran breaking dawn in the field that he was best at? Then, something happened that made everyone's eyeballs fall to the ground. This time, 512 magic hands and their corresponding magic arrays exploded at the same time. In the next moment, the aggressive hellhounds and the water elemental army actually turned around at the same time. Faint golden halos lingered on their foreheads, and it felt as ridiculous as forcing demons to play the role of angels. Unfortunately, their attacks were not laughable. The hellhounds' continuous silence, and the water elemental's magnificent frost arrow rain, caused Antonidas to be flustered. That's right, low-level mysteries were destined to be unable to shake high-level mysteries. But these hellhounds were summoned by Antonidas with his Breaking Dawn magic power, and they were of a relatively high rank. Although their silence could not stop Antonidas's every spell. Just as the Great Lich was busy increasing the variety of spells to avoid Duque's interference, this undoubtedly added fuel to the fire. Summon counter control?
Antonidas finally could not help but curse.
Duque, you lunatic! You clearly had hopes of breaking through to Breaking Dawn. You actually went to become a spellbreaker? Yes, a spellbreaker. A special profession that specialized in destruction and distortion of magical energy. Specializing in magic steel, magic immunity, and summon counter control were enough for spellbreakers to completely suppress mages of the same rank. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the bane of mages. But this was not without a price. Disrupting the enemy's magical energy and distorting their magic circuits, as an existence that broke order, they would definitely suffer the backlash of the chaotic power. Why had Xueqi Salus never reached a higher rank even though he specialized in nurturing spellbreakers? It was because spellbreakers could not withstand the backlash of magic power, and would collapse before their magic circuits reached a higher rank. Moreover, the more techniques the spellbreaker used, the faster the spellbreaker's strength would decline. That was why Duque, a peak Radiant Moon Great Wizard, had gone to train as a spellbreaker. In the eyes of most mages, this was putting the cart before the horse. Spellbreakers could at most attack half a rank higher. For example, as a peak Radiant Moon, Duque could barely destroy the spells of a rank 5 or 6 Breaking Dawn wizard. It was no wonder that Antonidas had gone crazy. How much hatred do you have for me? Is it necessary to specially train spellbreakers to deal with me? Or did I accidentally get caught in the crossfire? Facing Antonidas' accusation, Duque smiled. Beneath his feet, the power of the sun well had been greatly suppressed by the Lich King's power of darkness. After all, Nazul was so far away from no scent, and the power here decreased with each use, but the Sunwell branch he controlled had an endless supply. Chapter 8:12. Now that Antonidas, the transfer station of magic power, was suppressed, Duque could use more magic power. He stood with his hands behind his back. As he walked, the volcano under his feet slowly rose, forming a path of lava that led to Antonidas. However, under Xueqi's feet, every drop of fire element automatically separated. When Xueqi's feet landed, the lava automatically cooled down to a normal temperature, allowing Xueqi's feet to step on it. Around Xueqi, the smoke of the magic war grew more and more intense. Antonidas kept coming up with more types of magic, some of which only existed in legends. Not to mention a young mage like Jaina, even Croesus, who had lived for thousands of years, looked as if he had seen a ghost. Even though he had the encyclopedia of red dragon magic, he had only heard of many spells before. Even more terrifyingly, even though it was a spell that nobody had seen before, Xueqi merely glanced at it and paused for half a second, before a corresponding magic hand appeared in the void with a brand new magic array and cancelled Antonida's spell. Every senior rank mage who witnessed that scene was at a loss. They mumbled to themselves, "That's impossible." Chaos and order had been opposing each other since ancient times. Those who created chaos would be harmed by chaos. That should have been an unbreakable truth. But what did they see now? Anyone with enough magic knowledge could tell that Xueqi had created a temporary magic circuit outside his body, and used it to push a brand new magic array to resist and counteract Antonida's spell. When the magic array cancelled out the opponent's spell, all the magic backlashes would be borne by the temporary magic circuit. Be it chaos, shattering or collapsing. All the damage stopped outside of Xueqi's body. It couldn't cause any damage to Xueqi himself. Besides, even the magic power to create the temporary magic circuit and the new magic array was provided by the branch of magic power in the Well of the Sun. Xueqi had completely gained something without risking anything. No. If there was anything Xueqi had to pay for, it would be his astonishing knowledge and inhuman reaction speed. Since ancient times, the birth of every magic was accompanied by countless painful experiments. The more powerful a spell was, the higher the price it had to pay. Even Breaking Dawn mages would have to kneel if they tried to analyze an ancient spell when their legacies had been severed. Not to mention researching a disruptive spell to counter this rare spell. At this moment, it was a situation that made Antonidas and all the witnesses break down. Antonidas' spells in all magic domains were countered. At some point, the battles between the Radiant Moons had come to a halt. Both sides retreated with a clear distinction. They had a tacit understanding of each other after fighting for so long. Given the current situation, it was impossible to bypass the other party and interfere with the duel between Breaking Dawn wizards. On the other hand, once a victor was decided, the enemy's forces at or below the Radiant Moon level would definitely crumble. Rather than spending a great deal of effort and still not being able to affect the outcome of the battle, why not save it for later? Croesus took a deep breath as if he was about to unleash a dragon's breath. The only explanation now is that Duke has read all the magic books in Karazhan and prepared a counterspell for every spell recorded in them, he said in a rumbling voice, as if he was about to unleash a dragon's breath. That's impossible. How old is he? Jaina Goldsword cried out in shock. She could not be blamed for crying out. High elves had extremely long lifespans. She had been unhappy with the decadent atmosphere of the Silver Moon Parliament. After reaching the Radiant Moon realm and discovering that they could not advance to the Breaking Dawn realm, they decisively led a befuddled life and did not seek to improve. That was why she had left Kuel Salis and wandered the continent. There had been a period of time when she had been a member of the Dalajan Kirin Tor Parliament. It was to borrow the Dalajan's books legally. However, it had taken her 3,000 years to read all 100,000 magic books. With her achievements, it was enough for her to be proud to call herself a polymath. It was not impossible to create a counterspell for the spells in the books. But it was definitely not so fast, so accurate, and so perfect. The problem was that now, what Xueqi had done had subverted all her common sense. Beside her, Jaina calmed her rapid breathing from the fierce battle and recalled bits and pieces of Xueqi. She suddenly smiled bitterly. Xueqi is a superman who can use 100 magic hands to flip through a report and 100 magic eyes to read a report at the same time. Jaina's words almost choked the surrounding archmages to death. That's right, this was not something that could be done in a day and a half. As early as the second battle at the Dark Portal, there was an exaggerated feat of Xueqi single-handedly taking care of the logistics of the entire alliance. Unexpectedly, after more than 10 years, this godly skill of Xueqi seemed to have become even more amazing. Just thinking about it made the bystanders feel like they were going to collapse. How big was the Karazhan library? According to Jaina's memories, even if they didn't count the well-hidden secret and forbidden books, there were more than 1 million books outside. If it were an ordinary human mage,
Even if they died reading here, it would be impressive if they could read through 10,000 books in their lifetime.
Everyone only knew that Xueqi was different from them. But they couldn't dissect Xueqi. For Xueqi, as long as he scanned every page of any book, it would automatically form an identical magic book in the system library. It wasn't as simple as just recording. When Xueqi's brain was idle, the system elf would also borrow Xueqi's brain power to analyze all the spells in the magic books, deducing, simplifying, condensing, and marking out the flaws and developing counterspells on his own. In the memories of the years when Gina was studying under Xueqi, Xueqi was often like an ignorant and incompetent book-flipping criminal. Walking to a bookshelf, regardless of what book it was, with a snap of his fingers, from bottom to top. He used the hand of magic to flip through the books in order, flipped them once and then put them back. The only difference was that at that time, there were at most 10 hands of magic and eyes of magic working. At that time, Xueqi didn't look like he was reading at all, but flipping through the books to see if there would be anything like golden leaves in them. Jaina would never have thought that Xueqi, with the help of the system elf, was studying magic books at a speed 100 times faster than a normal person 24 hours a day. Studying while eating. Studying while drinking water. Summarizing while sleeping. Even when they were having sex, the system elf also faithfully helped Xueqi categorize and summarize magic knowledge. That was why there was this incomparably terrifying Xueqi now. As long as there was enough magic power. Xueqi was the god of magic. Magic exploded between Xueqi and Antonidas like brilliant fireworks, then dissipated with the wind. Before he knew it, Xueqi had walked to 10 meters in front of the Great Lich. Xueqi's lips curled into a smile. Spellbreaker? Who said I was a spellbreaker? I'm just a spellbreaker in the world. Chapter 8:13. Unbreakable. Xueqi's voice spread far and wide. If Xueqi hadn't destroyed all the spells that were known as the Encyclopedia of Magic in front of 200,000 people. If Xueqi hadn't been the most powerful wizard in the Alliance who'd become a Breaking Dawn long ago. If Xueqi's opponent hadn't been the great Lich Antonidas, who was also a Breaking Dawn. If Xueqi didn't turn the tide time and time again under the crisis, Xueqi's seemingly boastful words were enough to make all the pharaohs in the world curse Xueqi and scold Xueqi. But now, in the face of absolute battle achievements, no one cared if you were a fake Breaking Dawn. Everyone could see Xueqi beating up the Sun King, a Nastrian Sunstrider, and now Antonidas, who was also a Breaking Dawn, being ruthlessly suppressed. The reason why a legendary hero could become a legend was not only because of his shocking achievements, but also because of rumors and exaggerations. One had to be strong to forge iron, but without advertising, who would know if one was strong enough? Xueqi was closing in on Antonidas step by step. This was an imminent threat to the Great Lich, but from another perspective, it was also an opportunity. Evidently, as Antonidas continued to throw out new spells, Xueqi had less time to break them, and the situation became more dangerous. Both of them had immense magic power. One was the power of darkness, while the other was the power of light, the power of the sun. For a moment, the elemental turbulence around the two combatants grew more and more violent due to the intense explosions. It was like a raging storm. Xueqi, you clearly had such strength, so why didn't you use it at the start? Why did you have to wait until I fell before using it? Why did you make me so ugly? From Antonidas' tone, it seemed like he was blaming his fall on Xueqi. Looking at the Great Lich, Xueqi couldn't help but recall the extremely conservative policies Antonidas had adopted in the past decade. Sigh. It's exactly because you've become so stubborn and arrogant that this has happened. Xueqi shrugged. You couldn't defeat a dreadlord in a one-on-one fight, and you were even killed by a trap set up by the enemy. So you're blaming me? You. Antonidas uttered the word you 3 times in a row. His cloudy eyeball looked like it was going to fall out of his rotten skull at any time. Xueqi's facial muscles twitched as he cursed in his heart. That's why I hate liches. They affect the city too much. Whether Antonidas liked it or not, he was now immortal. Unlike Servanas, who had become the undead queen in history, it was understandable that he, who had taken the path of a lich, had given up on himself because of his disfigurement. Understanding was not the same as understanding. Their different standpoints meant that the two of them would not let each other go. No one could turn back now. Just as Xueqi expected, Antonidas was like a giant beast that devoured the heavens and earth. After swallowing a huge amount of dark force, he finally released his ultimate move. Suddenly, a majestic and cold aura spread across the entire world, as if winter had suddenly descended. The endless chill spread in all directions with the Great Lich as the center. In the blink of an eye, there was no longer a boundary between heaven and earth. The gray sky disappeared. The Isle of Quelled Dawns, where even the sand was emitting a faint sunlight, also disappeared. The entire world was only left with a gloomy white. It was the plains of death covered in ice and snow. It had to be said that Antonidas, who had started his career playing frost magic, seemed to be fated with the Lich King. However, Xueqi still had an undisguised look of surprise on his face. According to the system notification, Antonidas had injected more than 80% of his soul into this gray and white world. It was not unusual for any demigod to use a huge amount of magic as energy and his own soul to build an imaginary domain world. In the realm of demigods, some demigods like to strengthen their bodies to the extreme, while others like to use their domain world to suppress their enemies. For example, the Queen of Dreams, Isera, walked the path of becoming one with her domain world. As long as she was in the dream world, she was the strongest. She was the Emerald Dream, and the Emerald Dream was her. Once her main body or the Emerald Dream was corrupted, she would be finished. It was obvious that Antonidas had chosen the same path as Isera. What a pity! Xueqi felt that it was a pity. It was a pity that Antonidas had used it at the wrong time. If Antonidas had been a peak Breaking Dawn and was about to break through, he might have been able to break through the Breaking Dawn bottleneck and become a demigod after borrowing the Lich King's dark force. But now, a certain someone had shamelessly taken away many of his magic circuits, and his newly created magic circuits had yet to be completely stabilized. In addition, his strength was far from the semi-god level. If he brazenly unleashed a domain that he was unfamiliar with, it would undoubtedly be destroying his own future. This might be the only chance in his life for him to step into the realm of domain world. From then on, because of the damage to his soul, this once unparalleled human great wizard, no matter what form he existed in the world, had no room for growth. It was not that Antonidas did not hesitate. He was not so decisive, and he was not fanatically loyal to the Lich King. He was purely treated as an abandoned pawn by Nazul. Yes. In a sense, Nazul did not lack Lich fighters. Now he had Anastrian, the resurrected Kel, Thuzad, and Antonidas under him. In terms of loyalty, Antonidas could not compare to Kel, Thuzad, who was like-minded with the Lich King. In terms of strength, Anastrian was actually a head above Olden. If the price of Antonidas not being able to advance again in the future was to eliminate a great enemy like Xueqi, then it was really worth it. Xueqi could not help but sigh. As expected, once one's strength weakened, it would not end well. Antonidas pulled him into the icy plains of death. In his domain, other than what Xueqi had, all external forces were isolated. Xueqi's biggest problem was undoubtedly that he could no longer borrow elemental power from the outside world. Of course, this included the most important magic power of the Sunwell branch. Although Antonidas might not be able to maintain the domain for a long time, it was still quite fatal to Xueqi. After all, after losing the help of external forces, Xueqi immediately returned to his original form, becoming the pharaoh whose magic power was only at the peak of the Radiant Moon realm. It had to be said that Antonidas was a veteran powerhouse who had experienced hundreds of battles. Although the older he got, the more extreme he became, and he once lost his soul and had his soul captured, his sensitivity and judgment towards magic battles were still as good as before. He immediately grasped Xueqi's weakest link. Chapter 8:14. In the endless snowfield of death, Xueqi's figure was so lonely and helpless. The aura of the Alliance commander and the glory of the legendary hero seemed to have faded at this moment. Xueqi could only rely on himself. Xueqi. Duke Marcus. Are you still going to struggle in vain? What's the point of your resistance in the face of the mighty power of the Lich King? Antonidas' voice echoed in the entire white world. His loud voice made Xueqi's eardrums hurt. F***CK. Aren't you the underling of someone else's underling? Even you, Nazul, have to kneel in front of me. What are you pretending to be? Xueqi couldn't help but complain. Suddenly, the clouds in the sky were so thick that they were almost solid. Obviously, Antonidas, who had turned himself into the world, had a dark expression on his face. Although he didn't like looking up, Xueqi still looked up at the sky. He looked at the world as if he was looking at Antonidas. Suddenly, Xueqi felt a little pity for this former elder of the Alliance. Xueqi was not a saint. It was impossible for him to save everyone in front of the aggressive dark forces, especially when fate had changed dramatically. Compared to the current fallen Antonidas, the original ending of being killed by Arthas and directly becoming a ghost wandering in the ruins of the Dalagan seemed a little more glorious.
Alas!
Xueqi sighed.
If Antonidas fought him in a place far away from the Well of the Sun, or outside of the domain, he would naturally be beaten like a dog.
After losing his life, Xueqi might not even be able to escape with his soul. Why did Antonidas have to drag him into an immature field?
If this was a domain that had been truly tempered and condensed after continuous improvement, it could only belong to Antonidas.
Perhaps this time, it would be Xueqi who would kneel. This domain, on the surface, maximized his ice magic and completely rejected all power except ice and death. In fact, this world was not Antonidas' home field in the real sense. This was a domain that the Lich King Nazul had used Antonidas as a medium to weave the laws of the Lich King.
Antonidas!
Xueqi could not help but sigh. His eyes filled with pity.
What?
The veteran Breaking Dawn Great Wizard was startled, his face full of vigilance. Then he saw Xueqi's gaze change. It became cold and mechanical. He didn't know what it was. If he knew, he would have stopped Xueqi immediately. At this moment, there were many green dots of light pouring down from top to bottom in Xueqi's retina. This was naturally the data provided by the system elf, who had completely fused with Xueqi's soul. After the system's transformation, the entire domain world was no longer what it looked like with the naked eye. It was a digitized world made up of countless zeros and ones.
In this world that had been completely transformed into binary, every bit of Antonidas's magic flow could not be hidden from Xueqi's eyes that had been strengthened by the system.
Xueqi spoke, his voice low and full of regret. We could have been friends despite the difference in age, but every time, you treat my help as a deal. So, you don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you anything. Let me end this. As he spoke, Xueqi slowly raised his arm and stretched out his palm towards the void.
His clenched palm was clearly grabbing the air in front of him, but in an inconspicuous void in the distance, there was something that had the same shape as Xueqi's hand. Antonidas condensed his face in mid-air, and one could clearly see that the old Lich's eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets.
There was indescribable horror in his voice. This is impossible. How did you know?
The corners of Xueqi's mouth curled up slightly.
Actually, you're the inexperienced one. You shouldn't have used your magic circuit model to create this domain.
Because you were afraid that you couldn't withstand the dark power that Nazul had gathered for you, the first thing you thought of was to use the circuit you were most familiar with as a foundation.
But you couldn't have. Xueqi raised his left hand and shook it proudly. Have you forgotten? 14 years ago, it was you who personally gave me the prototype of the Arcane Throne and the Crown of Ice magic circuit. Since I used the same circuit prototype as you, how could I not have studied where it was easiest to destroy? Bastard! Antonidas was exasperated. He roared and immediately set off a wild wave. He was about to drown Xueqi with absolute dark power. But time suddenly seemed to freeze in the entire space. Because the old Lich saw Xueqi take out a round, egg-sized scale that emitted a red light.
This was a treasure that Xueqi had spent 81 times to exchange for from the hands of a certain giant dragon imperial sister with great difficulty. Although it was accidentally knocked off by a certain dragon thousands of years ago, and new scales had already grown, how could something that belonged to a dragon aspect be worthless? Scale of life. A dragon scale that contained the high heat and strong vitality of a dragon's breath. Under normal circumstances, this was just a good epic item. But for the Calamity Army, which specialized in coldness and death, this was a super-killing weapon that was no less than a divine artifact. In such an occasion, the lethality was definitely on the level of a nuclear bomb. And now, he was going to give it to Antonidas as a gift. No, this is impossible. Antonidas could hardly believe what he saw.
When Xueqi rushed back, even Lord Darren had not fallen.
Could it be that he had already foreseen the fall of Arthas, and had asked Alexstrasza to prepare a treasure to deal with the Calamity Army?
How could there be such a coincidence in this world?
Or could it be that all the mages of the Mediv had the ability to prophesy?
Antonidas would never have thought that Xueqi was a super troublemaker from another world. Antonidas was on the verge of a mental breakdown. His domain was clearly his home field. In this world created by his power, he should have the absolute advantage. Why did it seem like he had sent his phylactery to Xueqi's hammer and let Xueqi smash it? But this was not entirely his world, and he could not control it at all. As the dark power continuously flowed into his soul, he could not even stop it.
No! The Great Lich let out a scream.
Xueqi sighed and shook his head. He flicked his finger and the dragon scale to a place where 36 magic circuits converged.
It's over, Antonidas.
Chapter 8:15. Arg! Antonidas let out an earth-shattering scream. The entire world was like a living person getting goosebumps. Immediately, countless bumps that made people shudder appeared, as though something was about to explode and erupt.
Arg!
Antonidas' original form screamed as he appeared in this world. Although he had hidden himself a long time ago, any place that dealt with the most power of darkness would definitely have the core of his soul. After knowing this, under the scanning of the system elf, the pitiful Great Lich had nowhere to hide. Without the sage-like appearance of an old wizard with fluttering white hair and beard, and without the aura of a supreme being who commanded thousands of men and horses, Antonidas, who had lost all external disguises, looked no different from a ghoul hugging its head and curling up into a ball. Xueqi's scale of life did not just destroy the main vein of this domain world, but also the order of this world. The overly concentrated power of darkness rampaged in his soul, as though it would explode at any moment. At the very end, he stood up straight, his body trembling as though there were whips lashing at him every moment. If Xueqi's guess was right, this was a punishment from the soul.
Antonidas' voice trembled, but there was a sense of tranquility.
Xueqi, I've made many mistakes in my life, but my greatest honor is to have once created a prosperous Dalajan. On account of the time we fought side by side, please promise me to revive the Dalajan. Finally, please give me a quick death. I don't want to return to the throne of Nazul.
Xueqi was a little surprised.
Not every soul was named Uther or Bolvar, and could resist the terrifying pressure of the Lich King.
Although he did not think that Antonidas had such willpower and boldness, which could be seen from the old wizard's fall, he really did not think that the old wizard would be able to break free from the Lich King's soul shackles at the last moment of his collapse. This made Xueqi inexplicably feel more respect for the veteran Breaking Dawn wizard, who had ruled the Dalajan for nearly 50 years.
Good. I promise you, I will revive the Dalajan. Just as I did with Stormwind. An expression of relief appeared on Antonidas's withered face, which was unique to a lich. In Xueqi's green world that had been digitally altered by a sea of zeros and ones, he could clearly see that Antonidas was collecting all the pieces of his soul into this body. In his field of vision, Antonidas's face quickly changed back to the appearance of a living person, that wise elder with white hair and a white beard. At this time, Nazul's sharp and exasperated voice came from the void.
No!
Antonidas! Your soul belongs to me.
You have no right to deal with your own soul. Antonidas was anxious.
Xueqi, hurry up and move.
Even if I only have 10% of my soul left, Nazul can still forcefully resurrect me and force me to serve him.
Xueqi's heart suddenly skipped a beat.
Without hesitation, a golden shadow suddenly rushed out from Xueqi's body.
It was an illusion that was identical to Xueqi's real body. The biggest difference between it and Xueqi's real body was that it emitted an incomparably holy aura. Between the index and middle fingers of its right hand was a coin. In the next moment, the coin turned into a standard cross sword that knights love to use. The cross sword emitted a golden light and pierced into Antonidas's forehead like lightning. This sword? Antonidas's expression suddenly changed, and a smile of relief appeared on his face. A voice floated into Xueqi's soul. Thank you, Xueqi. In the Dalajan, 300 meters below my wizard tower, there is my last treasure. The password is to connect my 2 magic circuits with my real name. Xueqi's whole body trembled. He really did not think that after killing Antonidas, there would be such extra equipment. Xueqi saw that a large number of zeros and ones around him were speeding up the separation. Antonidas's elemental power was disintegrating.
In just a few seconds, the snow-white world supported by the dark power quickly faded, and the periphery gradually returned to the seaside scenery on the Isle of Queldonas.
It's Xueqi? Sylvanas was the first to see the figure inside clearly. Her heart failed to live up to her expectations and started beating wildly. Immediately, there was a burst of screams from the crowd. They did not think that the battle between the two would be so terrifying. The huge dark power turned into a huge cocoon with a diameter of a kilometer, tightly wrapping the two people. No outsider would be able to get involved. He had thought that this would be an evenly matched battle that would drag on for a long time. Who would have thought that in less than 3 minutes, the winner would be decided?
Xueqi thrust his sword forward, and the illusory blade of the golden cross sword was like a burning golden flame, directly igniting the old lich's body. The long sword that was like a holy sword pierced through the great lich's head and rapidly melted his soul. This scene, in the eyes of the 200,000 soldiers, was like an apostle of God using supreme divine power to punish the evil fallen. Everyone's expression was gone, leaving only a look of disbelief.
Saint Xueqi. Oh my God! It really is Saint Xueqi. The people unconsciously murmured, reciting the nickname of Xueqi when he revived Stormwind and saved the people with supreme wisdom and internal power. That's right. Saint Xueqi. The legendary name that was transmitted by every bard shone again at this moment. Not only were the humans and a few dwarves shouting, but Theron even found that many elves were also shouting Xueqi's holy name. On the other side, after Xueqi's golden illusion stabbed the sword, Antonidas's withered body trembled violently. When Xueqi's illusion pulled out the golden sword of holy light, the illusion disappeared.
Xueqi put his hands behind his back, stepped on the sand, and walked to the side of the former chairman of the Kirin Tor.
This once famous mage leader could no longer maintain the illusory appearance of an old mage, and had returned to the form of a lich. Xueqi looked at Antonidas's turbid eyes. At this moment, he could not even feel the joy of victory in his heart. He only asked calmly, "Is this okay?" The great lich's throat gurgled, but in the end, it seemed that because his vocal cords had decayed for too long, he still could not make a sound. At this moment when his soul was beginning to collapse, further emotional expression seemed to be an extravagant hope.
Looking at him, Xueqi could not help but show a trace of sadness in his eyes. In his impression, there did not seem to be a good ending for fallen people. Xueqi took one last look at the sad old mage and turned to leave.
But this former supreme ruler of the Dalajan was like the last radiance of the setting sun. His body trembled violently, and then there was a whisper in the wind. It was a sound that Antonidas had recalled thousands of times, and who knew how many times he tried to control his throat to squeeze out a sound. "Thank you." That was a human, not an undead, expressing his gratitude at the end of his life. Xueqi stopped and replied softly, "You're welcome. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.